Hi, Misha here, and we're doing a deep dive into the Japanese Air Force, specifically jet fighter aircraft and trainers, all the way from the very first ones in 1955-56 to the ones coming into service in 2023. It's very interesting. And some of these are indigenous, a few. Some are just straightly obtained from the USA, but most are customized for the Japanese purpose, which has always been unique to themselves following World War II. So let's get into that history real quick before we start looking at the first aircraft. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. Maybe check out the Patreon, because this is a long video, but it's one I've been excited to do for months now. So, yeah, honest to God, excited to do this, even if it's going to take a lot of effort. And getting all these back on the shelf is going to be a lot of effort too. I cringe thinking about it, but oh well. Some of them needed dusting anyway. These are all 1/72 scale. They're all die-cast. The majority are Hobbymaster. No Corgis this time, because they don't really do much in the way of Japanese aircraft. But we do have a few oddballs here and there. So, let's go back to 1945 and the end of the Second World War in the Pacific. Condensing in a lot of history, between 1945 and 1952, Japan was an occupied nation. They had no military. They didn't really even have much of a police force, at least not one that was armed. But in 1952, the occupation ended, although of course the US and other allies would leave forces there. Really at Japanese invitation. You can go back and forth on how legitimate that was, but for the most part it's pretty legit. Because Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, passed in 1947, I believe, just overtly said, Japan renounces warfare. And true, the government that the US helped into power after the war was pro-peace, but they were Japanese. They were elected to the Diet and others. And it was legitimate. And the Japanese, once they came to terms with what happened, what some of them even did in the war, they were, at least most of them, deeply ashamed, certainly regretful. Anyway, time to move on. No more war. And this is actually why the Japanese have never fought a war with their military, which didn't even exist until 1954. It was that year that the government authorized the formation of a Japanese self-defense force. And in July 1st actually of that year, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force was officially formed as a counterpart to the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, JASDF. But these were strictly speaking to defend the home islands and nearby waters and airspace, and never to be aggressive. In fact, their laws and constitution forbade them from even selling weapons of war to belligerent nations, which is why these aircraft are all going to be exclusive to Japan, even if a couple of them would have made a really good export for Mitsubishi or Kawasaki or Fuji. And of course, Japan didn't have an aircraft industry. They had a lot of work to do to catch back up, especially with the communists winning the war in 1949 in China, the Korean War, and of course increased Soviet aggression throughout the decades at various times. So the Allies were very much wanting Japan to come in with an army on their side to kind of counterbalance Russian forces. They weren't willing to do anything like UN NATO operations, but they were eventually willing to establish the self-defense force. So 1954 is when this begins, and starting from scratch, and starting with jets. You don't really see a lot of propeller aircraft because they just kind of that passed them by. And in the beginning, since they had no factories, no industry, they would have to rely on the US or theoretically some other nation like Britain, but they too are still rebuilding, so it was going to be the US. And what better place to start than with an aircraft named after the continent it's from? So, let's dive in. The first JASDF squadron stood up, I should say, at the beginning of 1956. But before you can operate jet fighters, you have to have training with jet trainers. So the place to begin is not with a cool fighter interceptor, but something that was very important to the Japanese air self-defense forces for decades. The Kawasaki T-33A, also known in Japan as the Wakataka Young Hawk. Technically, this was the JASDF's very first jet aircraft fighter type, even though it was only ever used as a trainer. In this model here, as I said earlier, all these will be 1/72 scale die-cast, but this one is an old one from Falcon, because no one else really does the T-33 or the P-80/F-80 Shooting Star for that matter, which is really quite a shame, at least not in 1/72 scale die-cast. So, what's the story here? Well, let's dive in. First, apologies if I'm a little rusty. I feel like I'm rusty. I took a couple of weeks off doing videos, recording them, though I've had plenty to show you a backlog. So I'm getting back in the groove while doing laundry. It's a classic around this channel. But anyway, diving in. Like I said, July 1st, 1954, the JASDF was officially created, and they would search about for a new jet fighter and jet trainer. And rather quickly, a deal was struck with Lockheed, or rather, the U.S. Air Force. Initially, 68 former U.S. Air Force T-33A Shooting Stars were transferred to Japan. As I said in the intro, the Allies were actually quite eager, more than the Japanese, truth be told, to have Japan kind of join in the bulwark against perceived communism and, the whole domino effect doctrine that would soon come to prominence in Western mindsets. Politics are fun. Anyway, the first batches were the late style production T-33s, and like all late styles, they had two 50 caliber machine guns in the nose and did not have provisions for bombs under the wings, even for training. Earlier T-33s did, but the later ones didn't. And of course they had the large fuel tanks on the wingtips. And the very first of these were delivered January 20th, 1955. Meanwhile, it was decided that Japan would license produce the T-33 in country, domestically. The political reasons for it. And they looked at several companies. After World War II, their industry was non-existent, and they had a lot of work to do to kind of get back into the game. They considered several companies, but in the end, Kawasaki was picked. And so the deals were ironed out, and the very first ones, the first 20, were actually assembled in Japan from so-called knockdown kits, essentially planes put together in the U.S., taken apart, sent over to Japan, assembled with assistance. I have this kind of image in my head of like IKEA style, numbered drawings of how to put them together in pictogram form. That would be fun. And the very first Japanese-built T-33 would take off November 1956. And the last ones were delivered in 1959. After the first 20 assembled from kits, more and more parts would be made in Japan, and so many of the last ones were domestic, with, some foreign components need be. In total, we had 210 Japanese built, plus, again, the 68 former Air Force. And even though production was over in 1959, service was just beginning. In fact, in 1956, 57, there was a pilot shortage. So they desperately needed trainers because, they couldn't just slap a pilot in a fighter cockpit. You need to give him some training. And this was their first jet and their first interim jet trainer. I really like the T-33 because it's an evolution and expansion of the P-80, the U.S.'s first jet, at least that went into production. And it definitely outlived its parent and proved quite useful for a lot of air forces. Some were even used as kind of combat-capable aircraft, but not in Japan. These were never armed except for the machine guns, which themselves were removed in 1959, and the holes for the gun ports were ferried over, because this is when Japan was switching primarily from guns to missiles, and we'll get to that later in the video. Otherwise, they were pretty well unchanged. Simple, dependable craft. 38 feet long and a 39-foot wingspan thanks to these large tanks. Single engine, dual intakes in the front, straight wings for the most part, capable of a top speed of about 600 miles per hour with a cruise speed of a little over 450, max altitude of 48,000 feet, so pretty high. And a crew of 2, instructor and trainee pilot. Good old-fashioned analog jet engines. And these would be the primary interim trainer for a very, very long time. 60s, 70s, 80s. And, well, they started phasing them out in the 90s, around 92, 94, but the plan was to not fully retire the fleet until 2002. However, in 1999, an event would occur that would lead to the early retirement of this venerable fleet. And it's actually a very heroic, if also tragic, story. For several decades, the Starfighter, the Wakataka, served with very few incidents, a very good record. And not perfect, of course, it's a jet and trainees, but the fleet was aging and they knew that. They were pulling out the worn out planes or the damaged planes or the whatever, with the lower hour ones still flying. Luckily, they had quite a stockpile to choose from. And luckily, Japan had never went into war, so, hey, it's a defense force. But on November 22, 1999, the anniversary of the first flight of the first Japanese assembled T-33 back in 56, there was a training flight, and a fuel hose ruptured and caught fire to the plane. And the pilots, the crew, could have ejected, but that would have left the aircraft over and thus plummeting into a populated area. I believe it was actually a residential area, in fact. So the plane is losing altitude, and they have limited control, but they actively fly it out of where people are at into a more rural area, a safe area. Unfortunately for the crew, this aircraft was made long before the days of 0-0 ejection seats. They knew by saving potentially others on the ground from harm or death, they were pretty much dooming themselves. By the time the aircraft was safely out of the way, it was too low to safely eject, and therefore the crew sacrificed themselves to save the civilian lives, very much in the calling of any self-defense military force. And they were so duly honored. And because this made it clear that the fleet was just dated and was already scheduled for retirement, the T-33A was officially retired June of 2000, and the remaining aircraft were retired up or scrapped or what have you. Japan has never really been willing or even able under the law to sell off aircraft, so that was the end of their first interim jet trainer. But what a run. I mean, very few nations were flying a P-80 derivative into the last year, almost into the 21st century. A couple more months and you would have been past the year 2000. That's why I thought this was an important place to start. And these Falcon models are quite neat. While they might lack on some detail, they've made a lot of jets that no one else did, and they were early in the diecast game. They do have opening canopy, and while they don't come with figures, Hobby Master figures fit inside perfectly. They do have gear up or down. When it's, for the model, they do have ordnance, sometimes even removable, just depends what it is. And they're very heavy. The aircraft is almost entirely metal with only a few plastic parts, because in the early days of diecast, they were heavy sons of, and they're even solid, they're not even hollow metal. So even though the Falcons were once cheap, they never felt cheaply made, and I like them. I just wish someone would pick up some of their old lines. But let's say we've trained up some pilots. What are they going to fly into patrol and defending the home islands? And this was Japan's first jet fighter, rather day fighter, the F-86 Saber, or as it was known in Japan, the Kayokukyo, which is not a bad word, considering all it means is a ray of light from the rising sun. There's poetry in Japanese language. I said that even when I was talking about Japanese aircraft carriers way back when. And I'm going to keep saying these words so you can laugh at my pronunciation. And if you think I'm bad, you should hear my text-to-speech software. Especially when non-standard characters are involved. It freaks out. Like Hakote or Hakotai. Anyway, Japanese squadrons. That's where we begin here with this. It's a very interesting story. Going back to 1954, like I said, July 1st, the JASDF is founded, and immediately talks begin with North American to acquire the F-86 Saber. And, of course, the U.S. Air Force is involved. It's a whole thing. And this model is from Hobby Master, just so we know. The first, but far from the last one in this video. And at first, much as had done with the T-33, 180 ex-U.S. Air Force F-86s were selected. These would actually be Block 25s and Block 30s. And the U.S. really felt, it had produced thousands of the Sabres, and it was starting to move on to newer aircraft like the F-100 Super Sabre. So it should have plenty for its allies. Well, the F-86 Sabre was a victim of its own success. After the Korean War, it was popular, and Russia had the MiG-15, and the MiG-17 was coming around, and it wouldn't be long before the MiG-19 was everywhere. And so lots of allies wanted Sabres, and the U.S. realized it didn't have enough. So production had already ended at North American. 180, like I said, would be transferred to the Japanese. These would start to be received in 1955 and were pretty well standard aircraft. But it was decided to restart production with the F-86F Block 40. And they would do a run between 1955 and 1956 in the USA of 280. And of that run, 150 were earmarked to go to Japan. The others would go to other allies. I believe Turkey got some then, but I could be wrong on that. So the Block 40 was not made exclusively for Japan, but it was, the lion's share taker. And these would be delivered between April and December of 1956, entering into squadron service. I should point out that the Hakotai were quite regimented. Single-digit number of squadrons would get the F-86F, and we'll talk about what the others would get, the 100s, the 200s, and 300s series as we go on through this video. So, first off, how does the Block 40 differ from the previous Block 25 and Block 30? For the most part, it's the same aircraft, armed with 6 50 caliber Browning M3 machine guns, 1,800 rounds total. It has a total of 4 hard points, 200 each wing. 2 of them are plumbed. Standard was 200-gallon drop tanks. It could carry rockets, dumb bombs. Typically, about the maximum bomb size was 1,000 pounds. But again, the Japanese Self-Defense Force was not really looking to that. The fact that it could technically carry ground ordnance, even if unguided, would come into play later, though. The big difference was with the wing. With the Sabre, your leading edge slat, I know I was going to do that. That one's loose there. Put it back on in a minute. The leading edge slat is it was gone. It was there, then disappeared, and then it came back with the Block 40. And they extended each wing by about a foot. That gave a wingspan of just over 39 feet and an overall length of just over 37 feet. This change somewhat deteriorated maximum top speed, but it gave better handling, gave better takeoff and landing performance. It was able to operate from shorter runways, and generally was considered an improvement because at this time this was not going to keep up with supersonic aircraft. So if we can't keep up with them, we might as well really stretch the Sabre to where it's good, and that's subsonic performance, turning, agility, that kind of thing. And that's really the big differences. It is, because of the changes, about 250 pounds heavier, but because of the aerodynamics, it really had about the same handling, if even a little bit gentler. Top speed was about 680 miles per hour, with the cruise a little under 600. So yeah, using the Lockheed over here was a good trainer for this, and it had a maximum altitude of a bit over 50,000 feet. Again, in Japan, the primary armament would be its cannon. Speaking of the trainer, when the final 150, the final 45 were delivered to Japan at the end of 1956, they were actually put directly into storage because there were not enough trained pilots to fly them. So, yeah. And these would actually be returned to the U.S. in 1959 and resourced elsewhere because they were still technically American U.S. Air Force property. It gets a little convoluted with these and other aircraft. But that's only the beginning. Because whereas Kawasaki was selected for the T-33, Mitsubishi would enter the game with the Sabre. This Hobby Master is actually from the Blue Impulse team, essentially Japan's acrobatic team, Blue Angels equivalent, that flew the F-86F until the very early 80s. They were just one unit. 17 Hakotai would fly this. It was designated as a daytime fighter interceptor, primary role, but was acknowledged to have a secondary role as fighter bomber, although it was seldom used. Now, like I said, you would think, well, maybe they had enough. They returned 45 of the last batch and like 150 built in the U.S., but no. Actually, in August of 1955, the first knockdown kits were sent over to Japan from Mitsubishi. They would assemble the first planes in 56, and they would fly just a year later, August 9, 1956. That would be the first Japanese assembled aircraft. In the first batch, these would be known as the F-86 F-40 MITS from Mitsubishi. There would be 70 in the first batch, and again, all built from kits provided from the USA. And the last one would be delivered to the Air Force on December 7, 1957. So yes, 16 years after a certain incident. I found that anniversary kind of coincidentally funny. The second batch, which would be 110, still the Block 40 standard, would again be built from kits. The first of these, December 28th, 1957. And the last of the second batch would be leaving the factory February 14th, so Valentine's Day, 1959. And then drawing into the third batch, we can kind of see why Japan is doing this. There would be 120 aircraft, and these would be built in Japan. Of course, some components would still come from the US, but more and more indigenous parts and resources were being used. The first of these would be delivered February 28th, 1959, and the last one would be delivered in 1962. That gives us a total of 300 Japanese assembled and 180 brought over from the US for a total of 480. There would be the 150, even though 45 would actually be returned, and then 30 of the Air Force aircraft. There would actually be, I think, 10 Block 25s and 20 Block 30s. So a good chunk, meaning that over 400 would serve in the Japanese Air Self-Defense Forces. And they had their 2 roles, plus the aerobatic team here, and beginning in 1962, another role would be found for them. 18 of the Block 30s would be converted over to the RF-86F, which was a photo reconnaissance aircraft. And this would be operated by just one squadron, which would be Japan's sole photo reconnaissance squadron, as far as I remember throughout the whole time. But it is important to know that, yes, this third, or if you want to look into it this way, fourth role would be found for the aircraft. And yeah, 17 squads would fly these throughout the 60s and the end of the 70s. And in fact, they would not leave frontline service entirely until 1979, believe it or not. Although, of course, by this point, they're pretty well sidetracked by newer aircraft. But still, their subsonic performance, short runway takeoff, low maintenance, considerable, low fuel expense, they still had a purpose. And in fact, they would not be officially retired until March 15, 1982. And the Blue Impulse team would hand theirs in that year as well. Since they were still technically U.S. property, some would be handed back over to the USA, and they would be converted into the QF-86 target drone. So some would serve in missile tests and asymmetric warfare things and all that. There was always a place for these kind of first-generation subsonic jets. As Vietnam taught us, the MiG-17 could challenge even the F-4 and the F-105. At lower altitudes and slower speeds, they had some tight turning, and they had a gun, and they weren't afraid to use it. Speaking of, like I said originally, this only was able to drop iron bombs and rockets. But beginning in 1959, Japan would retrofit their fleet to start carrying the AIM-9B Sidewinder. So that would be the first appearance of a guided missile. Typically, they would just carry 2, with the other 2 pylons having the 200-gallon fuel tanks. In fact, I don't know if a Sabre could carry 4 Sidewinders. And before someone asks me, yes, I know that the name AIM-9 was not officially used until 1962, but yeah, confusing, enough going on here, I believe. And yeah, the reason is pretty apparent. Japan was building up its industry. First learning how to do assembly and maintenance, as well as training and flying, but then how to make more and more parts in-country, in-house. They were rebuilding an industry that had been dormant for a decade following World War II, and they really never did get into jet fighters in that war, not like Britain, Germany, and to some extent the US. So they're making up for lost time, and it's starting to show. Anyway, the F-86F was their daytime fighter interceptor. But at this era, you needed 2 aircraft for 24/7 coverage. So, what did Japan go to for that? One of the lesser known aircraft in history, but one I find actually quite cool, North American's F-86D, the Saber Dog, also sometimes called the Dog Sabre, or in Japan, the Gecko, which was moonray, moonbeam, moonlight. Yeah, good analogy. Kind of shows you the naming scheme. Daytime, well, this was the night fighter, a rather all-weather interceptor. And really, it being classified as an F-86 Saber was a bit of politicking in the USA. It actually started off as the YF-95, when it was intended to go into service as the F-95. Even though it has some lines much like the Saber, truth is it only is about 25% parts compatible with the standard F-86D and Fs, and it was actually based on the F-86A, but it's quite a bit different. For example, it's over 40 feet long, but has a wingspan of just about 37 feet, so a little bit narrower than the F version, but 3 foot longer. It has a top speed of about 750 miles per hour, so it's capable of going over Mach 0.93, making it transonic, really. And has a max altitude of just shy of 50,000 feet. And it lacks the Browning M3 machine guns. Instead, in the nose, it has a dome for a radar. And quite interesting for a radar interceptor of this time, it is a single-seater. That's because it was meant to be directed and controlled from the ground. It has a relatively short-range interceptor. Still has the 2 drop tanks. And its primary armament, because this was the 1950s when this was developed, were 24 2.75-inch, 70mm folding fin aerial rockets. The Mighty Mouse rocket there. It was a brief time in history, unguided. Basically, this tray would drop down and it would just dump them into the sky at a bomber, hoping some would hit. Before the time of radar guided, it's what you got. By the way, this model again is from Falcon. This one is from the Japanese Air Self-Defense Forces, but it was once a U.S. Air Force plane. I've seen some sources claim that Mitsubishi assembled these from kits in Japan, but I can't find any verification for that. It seems like only Italy, I think it's Fiat, did some work with the F-86D, building them or remanufacturing them. It seems like, no, Japan just took some surplus F-86s. The aircraft first flew in 1949 as a prototype, but really didn't go into U.S. service until after the Korean War, kind of trying to replace the F-89 Scorpion, and would soon be replaced by the F-102 Delta Dagger, which we're going to talk about in just a minute when it comes to Japan. It was a very interim step, and it was always meant to be. But the U.S. was rather bothered by new Soviet bombers, and this was a temporary response until something better could come along. By the way, the fire control system, which was rather complicated for the day, was also made by Hughes of F-102 fame. But no guns, just those rockets. Once they dumped them, it was to get the hell out of there and return to base. Beginning in 1958 and running through 1961, Japan would receive 122 of these to be used as their interim all-weather interceptor. It had no ground attack ability, and this would equip 4 squadrons, plus some would be kept for testing on the ground. But 4 had plenty of aircraft, left them with roughly 30 aircraft again, but some would be split off for testing and some would be kept in reserve. And they'd only be in frontline service for a brief time. Around 64, 65, they started to draw them out, and by 1968, the last Hakutai would retire their Sabre Dogs. It was always an interim, so they were in service for really less than a decade. You hear from my horrible Japanese pronunciation. I warned you at the beginning that I never really got into anime or anything like that. I just find these things interesting, and I find Japanese history interesting. And I love the F-86 Saber. So even though this one was never made in Japan, it was flown by Japan, and I just happened to have this one in Japanese colors. So we thought we would bring it out. And by we, I have no idea who the other person is. The cat, Hobo the cat, the one you hear meowing. Why not? But Falcon, again, this is a very heavy model. The Saber Dog was always a chunkier aircraft because it had to fit the radar and fire control systems of the time. I'm not going to say it was the most advanced plane for its era, but Yeah, it wasn't. And some other nations had the F-86K, which was a more improved version with a 20mm cannon. There were even some that were equipped with AIM-9B sidewinders and other service. But I don't believe Japan ever got around to refitting theirs, but I could be mistaken, because info on JASDF Saber Dogs is very skinny on the ground. But they definitely flew them, and it was part of that first early generation. And just a short recap, yeah, here's the first gen, the trainer and the 2 jets that protected Japan. Very, very limited fighter bomber, but wound their clock coverage for the day fighter, night fighter roles. And again, this is something that the Allies were very eager for Japan to do because of growing tensions after the Korean War. Of course, Vietnam will kick off soon, and Soviet Russia, and now Communist China. Having Japan be a major player in the Pacific theater was very important to them. And you start to see a close relationship, not always, but often, with the U.S. and other Western nations. And certainly Australia was in for Japan pitching in, because it was just part of the bulwark. But yeah, these are pretty much straight copies, or even straight from the USA. The next stage will show a little bit more independence and a little bit more consideration. After all, working with North American and Lockheed was a foregone conclusion in 1954, just to get something in the air for the nascent air defense forces. The next step, though, they would take their time a bit more. What did they come up with? We come to Japan's first air superiority fighter, if you will. High-performance interceptor. Its first supersonic, the Lockheed F-104J Starfighter, known to the JASDF as the Eagle, or Glory. Also known informally and somewhat lovingly, somewhat derisively to pilots as the Pencil, for pretty obvious reasons. And here we have our first 1/72 scale model from Witty Wings, an old one, which is why it's gear in the down position only. But it is all metal. It's a very chunky model, and a good place to start. Going to the mid-50s, around 1956, we have the Japanese FX program, designed to replace the F-86F and F-86D Sabres, because they know a subsonic aircraft isn't going to do the job, especially armed with just guns and rockets, against the next generation of Soviet bombers. And that was the idea. This was to be an interceptor to defend Japanese airspace. So, very dedicated role. What did they want? Their program had several requirements, as they always do, but really at the top of the list was Mach 2. That was the name of the game in the 50s. They were blowing past supersonic, and most nations were turning their attention in the mid and late 50s to Mach 2. That was the next big threshold. They also wanted an altitude of about 59,000 feet, pretty ambitious. They had some pretty stout time to climb and runway takeoff performance standards, landing standards, all that good stuff. And of course, it needed to be able to use the newest weapons against bombers. And at this point, 56, the folding fin rockets are already kind of looking dated. So what Japan would do, they would send a team over to the U.S. in 1957 for a long stay to look at what was on offer. So they knew they were going to go with the U.S., but they weren't sure which design and which company. So, what were the earliest contenders? In the beginning, 1957, we had Northrop. They had a project known as the N-156F, that was considered. They looked at North American's F-100 Super Sabre. They looked at the recently adopted by the U.S. Air Force Convair F-102 Delta Dagger. And they looked at this new critter from Lockheed, the F-104 Starfighter. And there were pros and cons to each. But late summer of that year, the powers that be in the military decided we're going to go with the F-100 Super Sabre. A few reasons why. Well, they've already had a good relationship with North American, and it's a tested design. True, it's had some issues in service, but by this point, it's matured. They're into the second generation of the Super Sabre. It gives the performance they wanted, supersonic and all that. So this was the pick. They did not go for the Northrop 156F, which would later evolve into the F5, but not for some time because it was still pretty much just a drawing board concept design at this point. They didn't go with the F-102 Delta Dagger because it was pretty new to service and was having its own issues, and it was by far the most expensive for Japan to invest in. And they didn't originally want the Lockheed F-104 because it had really just taken its first baby steps into the sky, along with its new J-79 engine, which would later become quite famous because of another aircraft. So it was not really tested. So the recommendation was for the F-100, and that's what they were going to go with. They were preparing to make an order when in September, October of 57, the Japanese president axed it. It was a political thing. The F-100, while it started off as a fighter, it was being increasingly used more and more as a fighter bomber by the U.S. Air Force and others, and that was not the image Japan wanted. So the fact that it had such a heavy fighter bomber secondary role made it politically distasteful. So North America's design was taken out of the running. So in 58, they have to kind of go back and reevaluate. And we do have a new aircraft, at least that wasn't, it was in the running a little bit in the beginning, but it was being considered more and more. Grumman's G98/J11, which was a Mach 2 version of the F-11F Tiger, known as the Super Tiger. So in 58, it's kind of down between the Starfighter, which by this point has evolved somewhat. Still early days for it, but it's got a little more time under its belt from Lockheed. And if North American's out, well, they have good working relationship with Lockheed as well, with the T-33, as I mentioned with its section. So maybe that. But this Grumman's really interesting them. So originally, they wanted the F-100. That got axed. And in 58, they decided, okay, we're going to go with the Super Tiger. That too would get axed. Honestly, whereas the F-11 Super Tiger was pretty good at low speed performance and handling, maybe even definitely better than the F-104, its conversion to being a Mach 2 capable fighter was pretty ad hoc. And the design had been essentially rejected by the U.S. Navy. Yeah, they had picked up some F-11s, but they ended up going with the F-8 Crusader instead. It was just not felt like it was a safe bet. For one, not really a proven design in the original form and the uprated form. They really wanted that Mach 2 capability. They weren't really caring so much about dogfighting. They needed a performance interceptor. Thus, November 1960, the Japanese government announced an agreement with Lockheed on an F-104 derivative, specifically based on the F-104G, one of the more evolved versions that West Germany and others would fly, but known as the F-104J here. It was customized to meet the technical and political requirements of Japan. Essentially the same airframe, of course. It is about 55 feet long with a very narrow, under 22-foot wingspan. I don't think that counts the fuel tanks, though. It's basically a rocket with stubby engines, a little bit of a cockpit, some gear, and carried some AIM-9 Sidewinders. The original F-104A had to be retrofit for the Sidewinder during pre-production, but by the G this was built for them, which is good. It did have a radar system as a standard equipment, which is good. Typically it would carry 2 to 4 AIM-9Bs. It could technically carry 6, but rarely would it do that. Usually even 2 or 4. And the G version could carry air-to-ground ordnance, but the J version lacked the gun sight, other air-to-ground equipment that was pulled out. In fact, originally they were going to even pull out the M61A1 Vulcan Gatling cannon, the 20mm cannon, and they started to build them that way, but they changed their mind, so they went back and retrofit most of the fleet to have the cannon, and they would have about 725 rounds. Kind of interesting that they did give a cannon. But they got what they wanted. Speed. This was Mach 2. The pencil here was great speed in a straight line. That's what it did. Did it very well. Not much else, but it did that. Turning and range and but it did have that speed. Altitude, they didn't really get that, about 50,000 feet, so they kind of let that go. You can tell what they were really wanting were the speed. The first test flight of an F-104J was June 30th, 1961, and this would be a version built in the U.S. by Lockheed and then transferred to the Japanese. But that was only the beginning. As usual, they wanted to assemble these in the U.S. only as far as they had to, and then transfer to Mitsubishi as the prime contractor, although we would have subcontractors, for example, the Japanese version of the J79 engine. And this would begin in 1962 with deliveries to the JASDF. So yeah, our Witty here, it's all metal, quite heavy, very glossy paint, no weapons on it. So it's kind of in a standard display or patrol mode. It does have a pilot in there, but the canopy doesn't open, gears in the fixed down position. The wheels do rotate. This is all metal. But let's move on to Hobby Master. Another F4J. And this one has a typical Hobby Master features, including coming with 2 AIM-9Bs. To be fair, I wish, while it's nice to have the gondola or catamaran underneath with missiles, I wish they had the wing hardpoints. For some reason, Hobby Master doesn't do that on most of their F-104s, and I don't know why. Now, you could mount, in reality, missiles on the wingtips, but that was very infrequent in the JASDF. They would either have nothing there or more often the tanks, but I wanted to show off just how small the wings and how thin they are. Even in the model in real life, they're even thinner. There's not much room for fuel inside this, but again, it was meant to take off and intercept a bomber. It did that just fine, and typically carrying 2 to 4 up to 6 missiles, and it does have a cannon as a backup, and it does have a radar, and yeah, worked for them. So as before, the first 3 were actually basically pre-production models built by Lockheed and transferred to Japan, and then they would start assembling these from knockdown kits, but far smaller numbers than before. In fact, only 29 would be built from kits provided from the US, and they would start transitioning over to Japanese. The aircraft built with American parts would be delivered to the Japanese Air Force between March of 62 and March of 65. This would allow time for training. The first squadrons started to lay hands on them in 63, and the first operational readiness was reached in 1966, by which time the fully Japanese-built versions were available. The last 178 built would essentially be all Japanese, at least near enough to not matter. And these would be delivered between 65 and 67. And would equip multiple squadrons. I believe it was around 7 would fly the Starfighter here, or the Glory if you prefer. And they would be strictly interceptors, day or night, all weather, and would be in frontline service for quite some time, even until the 80s. They started to be phased out in 81, 82, but they weren't officially retired in entirety until 86. So they flew them for quite some time. And generally they liked them. They had a better run in Japan than elsewhere. This was often nicknamed the Widowmaker. And definitely accident rates were devastatingly high in places like Canada and West Germany. While Japan didn't have the lowest accident rate, it was one of the lower ones. Around 15%, which, considering they flew them for 2+ decades, nearly a quarter century. Yeah, and the kind of attitude this aircraft seemed to have is not too shabby. Again, this one's neat from Hobbymaster that at least it does have some armament. By the way, the ones that didn't get the cannon, the around 50 that didn't, and the 210, they actually had a small extra fuel tank where the cannon would go, so it wasn't an entire loss there. A little more internal fuel never hurt for this aircraft, especially with its thirsty supersonic engine. And it wasn't like you could run the Starfighter at a low speed to conserve fuel and really get anything. This thing liked to go fast. Some aircraft, are technically capable of Mach 2, but really like to cruise at closer to Mach 1, Mach 1.2. Nope, not the Starfighter. It liked to go fast. In fact, with these wings, it'd probably fall off the sky otherwise. And that does kind of present a problem. Again, we need training. And a subsonic aircraft like the T-33, that ain't going to cut it. So here's another Hobbymaster 132 scale diecast, the F-104DJ, the 2-seat training version, although it is combat capable. Now the F-104D was a 2-seat trainer, but this isn't really derived so much from it. It's more of a 2-seat version of the J or F-104G if you prefer. By that I mean it uses the same engine, and like I said, it's combat capable. It does lack the gun. The front gear does fold a little differently, just for the second seat. And we do lose some fuel tankage, about 20% internal for that second seat. And we do have a slightly larger, wider, more massive surface area rear stabilizer. But it basically has the same performance, which is kind of what you want in a trainer. It could carry up to 4 AIM-9s, but not 6. It couldn't carry the ones on the underbelly, and it typically would need the fuel tanks on the wings because of its reduced internal storage. So really only 2 missiles went under each wing. That was possible, but never was actually done in Japanese service. I should also point out that originally the Starfighter used the AIM-9B in Japan. This would transition to the AIM-9E and eventually even the AIM-9P, which was an export model, but they would update that. And some sources say the F-104DJ didn't have the radar systems. I'm not sure about that versus the J. It may not have, but I do know it could launch weapons, but it never was. Now, these were never built entirely in Japan. Mitsubishi would assemble them from knockdown kits provided from Lockheed because they only purchased 20. They had 210 regular aircraft, so roughly 10% for training. That makes sense. They would start to deliver these in the summer of 62, and the last ones would be delivered in late winter of 64, which kind of explains why that first run was a little slow too with the J's. They were doing these as well. So this would be their first advanced trainer. And thankfully for them, never had to be armed. But it would kind of start a trend of a armed trainer option in Japan. You know, worst comes to worst, you can use them. And these would stay in service. As I said a minute ago, they had a pretty good accident rate for the Starfighter. They only lost 2 of the DJs during their time in service. I think they lost 34 or 35 of the Js, but then again, they flew a lot more in the hours department. Still around 15% though, all considered. Yeah, but pretty neat. You know, we mentioned with the Sabres, these are still kind of technically, partially, if not completely, U.S. property. And so after they were retired, some of them were sent back to the U.S., around 20 some odd, and turned into unmanned target drones. And others were actually transferred to the nation of Taiwan. And I believe they had 15 or so of the standard and 5 or so of the 2-seater. I think my numbers are a little off there, but some of these did get a second life around 86, 87 in Taiwan, where they would continue to see use into the 90s. So I think that's kind of interesting that those were actually Japanese assembled or built aircraft powering on. Interesting aircraft in Japanese service, and really gave them a taste of the cutting edge. The Sabre, while a good aircraft, by the time they got it, was not. This was, and that's why a lot of NATO nations flew it. Not the U.S. so much. The F-104A and Cs were pretty brief in U.S. service. It wasn't really an aircraft they wanted, but it was designed from the lessons of the Korean War. So a lot of nations jumped on it. Of course, we're just getting started with the Japanese Air Self-Defense Forces story. Oh yes. So let's move on. So by this point, Japan has established a new air force. They've learned training, they've practiced flight, they've done assembly, they've even done manufacturing. Now it's time for design. And this is a bit of a footnote, partially because my only model is actually from De Agostini, and it's not 1/172 scale, it's 1/100 scale. It's the only one I have. Oh well, the Fuji T1. But it is important, although not as important as I think they planned. Because they wanted to build and buy 200 of these, but they only built 66. Still, it's worth mentioning briefly. So, Japan never fielded a jet aircraft in World War II, although it did work with variants and versions based on the Messerschmitt Me-262 and even perhaps the Heinkel HE-162. They never went into service. Nothing was ever mass produced, and up until 1952, research and development was not allowed in Japan. But around that time, restrictions loosened, both domestic and foreign. So once it was clear that Japan would have a military of sorts again in 1954, plans were made to design, produce an entirely Japanese jet trainer. Seemed like a good place to start. And they're not wrong. So the T1 project began, and Fuji was selected to go for it because the other companies were doing things. This would really be their chance to design. They even were going to design an engine for it. But when they first had a test flight at the beginning of 1958, their Japanese, which would later become the T3 engine, wasn't ready yet. So the T1A, as it would become known as, had a British Orpheus engine as a kind of a placeholder. And work on the Japanese engine would continue. And in 1960, the first test flight of the T1B with the Japanese engine would take place. And they were ramping up. Like I said, they wanted to order a couple of hundred. But then the F-104J and subsequently the DJ came in. And so the order was reduced to 66 planes. And these were produced by Fuji between 1962 and 1963 and rather quickly delivered to the Japanese Air Self-Defense Forces as an interim, medium-level jet trainer. Unfortunately, while it gave them a lot of good design experience, it wasn't really anything impressive compared not only to the F-104DJ, but even the previous T-33. Two-seat, of course, around 39 feet long, about a 35-foot wingspan. It only had a top speed of about 575 miles per hour, so technically slower than the T-33. Also, it had a lower cruise speed. The T-33 was about 450. This had a cruise of about 400. It also had a slightly lower ceiling of about 47,000 feet. So overall performance was less. But then again, this is made in Japan and, had some aspects they really liked. It could carry two 100-gallon drop tanks, one under each wing, or a couple of 500-pound or even 750-pound bombs under each wing, although it never was armed. And it did have provisions for one 50 caliber machine gun in the nose, mostly for target training, that kind of thing. So, these would remain in service, kind of supplementing the T-33 for a number of years. They would start to be phased out around the same time in the 1990s. The last ones flew in 2000. They were retired in March of that year. The Japanese really like retiring planes in March, I've noticed. And the final ones that were kept for more testing and all that were retired in 2006. So even though it really didn't leave a mark, it was Japan's first production level jet, first domestic design, and showed a level of independence in engineering, ingenuity. I wish I had a better model of it, but oh well, these little D'Agostini's are cheap enough. They do have kind of a metal weight in them, but they're mostly plastic. If anyone knows of a 1/72 scale for the T1, let me know, please. But yeah, since this is clearly a subsonic aircraft, it's only really good for introduction and intermediate training and, just flight practice. It wasn't going to help with supersonic practice training, what have you. And by the mid-60s and into the 70s, that's definitely where we're at. The Starfighter replaced the Sabre as an interceptor, but it was a pretty narrow envelope of what it could do. In the early to mid-60s, Japan was looking for a more well-rounded fighter interceptor that could also have a secondary role for reconnaissance and surveillance, so they could retire the aging F-86 Sabres. And thus they hit upon the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom 2. Also sometimes informally known in Japan as the Samurai Phantom. And this is an interesting model from Hobbymaster, as it's meant to represent the first one ever delivered to the JASDF. So let's talk about what makes the F-4EJ different from a standard F-4E here. While the Japanese definitely shopped around for their next aircraft, there wasn't as much back and forth as with the Starfighter. After just a little bit, in November of 1968, it was announced that they would purchase the F-4E in a modified version, the F-4EJ. And very unique, Japan would manufacture them domestically. A lot of nations have used the Phantom. Many nations have updated their Phantoms domestically. But producing them in-house, that's pretty unique to the Japanese, but it's kind of suiting what they're doing here. And essentially, this is the same aircraft, F-4E, F-4EJ, and they're not messing around. This is a big one, 63 feet long, over 38-foot wingspan, crew of 2 is standard, pilot and weapons/radar operator. Radar is standard, capable of exceeding Mach 2.2, but had somewhat better performance, even though it is a flying brick compared with the Starfighter. One nice benefit, this uses essentially the same engine, not exactly, but essentially the same J79 engine as the Starfighter, which Japan was already making domestically. Max altitude of about 60,000 feet. So they finally met that original FX desire from a decade earlier. And it has quite a bit of weapons carriage capability, up to 18,000 pounds. But the Japanese version, the EJ, was air-to-air only. The air-to-ground was entirely removed. This would be the computer, the gun sight systems, wiring for things like the AGM-12 bullpup missile. I guess it maybe still nominally had the ability to drop like just dumb bombs, like iron bombs, but that was about it. They even removed the gun this time. The M61A1 Vulcan cannon was removed, unlike with the Starfighter. One thing I forgot to mention with the Starfighter, the aerial refueling probe, which to be fair was not standard with all Starfighters, was removed on the F-104J, and similarly the F-4EJ here lacked the aerial refueling capability, so it relied on drop tanks. It could carry the 600-liter center and the, what are these, 370 on the wings. It had the 4 AIM-7 Sparrows under the fuselage. And quite interestingly, the initial version here did not carry the AIM-9B or any variant. They actually carried the AIM-4D. And I did confirm this. The idea was to use the AIM-4D until the Japanese domestic missile, the AAM-2, was ready. Although Japanese Phantoms are seen with AIM-9s from time to time as well. So basically, we had 4 short-range air-to-air and 4 medium to long-range air-to-air missiles. Sorry about that, guys. Got startled there. And then you had a total of 3 tanks. With this Hobbymaster, since it's on the stand, the center tank's not there. And these wouldn't always fly with all 3 tanks. It just kind of depended anyway. 2 is often enough for their short-range missions. And originally these would have this kind of gray scheme. At least I think this one's still in the gray. But later they would get the kind of unique Japanese sea camo, the blue camo, or the land camo, the kind of greenish camo, depending on the mission. So, how did these get delivered? Very similar theme as with the F-104. McDonnell Douglas would build the first 2 the F-4EJs in the US, and this one here would test fly February of 1971 and then be delivered to the Japanese. After that, they would send 11 kits to Mitsubishi to assemble, and the first Japanese assembled one would fly May 12, 1972. And in August of that year, the very, very first one started to be delivered to squadrons, and training would begin in 1973. And by October of that year, the first squadron was declared operationally ready. It had 14 fully functional Phantoms. So already we're seeing the first entirely Japanese-produced Phantom by 1973. And they would go on to build a quite significant number. 138 were built in Japan over a 9-year production run. So not just cranking them out, but the JASDF was doing. It was one continuous production run at Mitsubishi, but they build a few, they take them, build a few. It was slow but steady feeding them into the system because they still had F-104s, so they didn't have the exact desperate need. But this allowed them to retire, replace the Starfighter and more auxiliary, and this allowed the F-4 to kind of become the primary frontline fighter interceptor. Had more missiles, a little bit faster, definitely higher altitude, better endurance. The second crew member was great for operating the radar. And of course, originally didn't have the ground attack abilities. But, yeah. The last one would roll out of Mitsubishi on May 20th, 1981. And this isn't just important for Japanese history, it's important for McDonnell Douglas and Phantom history, because this was the last Phantom built in the world, with almost 5,200 total built. So, holds a place in history there. By very quickly on, there would be up to 7 squadrons flying these as interceptors, a couple more as other things. And in 1979, the 301st, the first squadron to stand up with these, would actually do the first interception of a Russian bomber by the Japanese. I believe it was a Tupolev Tu-95, but I could be wrong on that. Kind of a famous case there. I think it was February 21st of that year. Kind of one of their early things. That's pretty much what they did. They flew patrol, intercept, and deterrence missions. And they did fly reconnaissance, and we will talk about the RF-4E, but let's table that for a minute, okay? So just to keep things going. And yeah, once the final Phantoms were delivered and training had begun, this is what allowed them to retire older aircraft. Like I said, the F-104 went out fully in '86, although it started to be phased out a decade before that. And we will see this aircraft's role change as politics change too. Very neat aircraft. It has the unique kind of edge slats for the EJ. There were a few customizations that they did. I just found it interesting that they initially flew with the AIM-4D. I don't believe they ever built the AIM-4D. I think they just acquired about 150 from the U.S. in 71, 72 as an interim solution. The Falcon didn't really do great in Vietnam, at least not off the Phantom. The problem was the cooling of the seeker head. It did much better in the F-102 and F-106, but I did a video on that already. But I do think this model's neat because it does have the Falcons. Sometimes they would just carry 2. This one is loaded with 4. 4 was the maximum it could carry because of the coolant system. And yeah, this would be a venerable member of the Japanese Defense Forces for many, many decades. The Phantom has definitely earned its spurs. But before we go into its future, let's talk about some domestic designs and changing doctrine within the Japanese government and thus armed forces and also the international community. Well, next we move to the "we swear we did not rip off the Apricot Jaguar," Mitsubishi's T2, K or Z depending on how you want to classify it, or T2A, T2B. This was an advanced trainer and Japan's first production supersonic jet aircraft, and yet another milestone and important step forward for the Japanese aviation industry and asset for the JASDF, whatever. Actually, JSDF would be technically correct for the overall self-defense forces. Anyway, let's discuss. And just in case you couldn't tell by now, this is a Hobby Master 172 scale diecast. As far as I know, they're the only ones that have ever done a T2. Going back to 1960-61, we have subsonic trainers, the T-33 and the nascent T1 coming. Yes, we will get the F-104DJ, but they only had 20. And it's a Starfighter. It's definitely an advanced trainer. They wanted something kind of in between. And they started calling this, we had the FX project in the 50s, and now this is the TX project. And really, design experimentation and kind of casting about for things began in 1964, lasting through 65, seeing what's out there, kind of feeling out. And they did go to the USA, and Northrop's T-38 Talon was what the U.S. was really wanting Japan to go with. They had already looked at Northrop's N-156F, which would soon become the F-5 Tiger. But really for the first time they looked to Europe as well. And right at this same time, Britain and France are working together, forming the Supercut company, which would ultimately result in the Jaguar in the early 70s. And the Japanese really liked the Jaguar because it was really built with the same basic requirements. 2-seat supersonic trainer, but with the option of a single-seat light tactical fighter or attack aircraft. Maybe. Right now they're just talking about a trainer and the TX, but, if a fighter came out of it, eventually, we would call it the SFX-1, but that's way down the road. So both were kind of built for the same requirements. And they approached the Supercut company to get a license to build these, and no one really knows what fell through, just that it did. Was it nationalism, patriotism? Was it money? Most sources seem to indicate that Supercut wanted too much money for licensed production. They probably would have been happy to sell the Japanese planes, but to let the Japanese build their own, not just assemble from kits, maybe not. So this falls apart. So, in 1967, the Japanese government, the self-defense forces, the generals, invite Fuji, Kawasaki, and Mitsubishi to submit design proposals for this new jet trainer. And in September of that year, Mitsubishi is selected, with Fuji listed as kind of the secondary subcontractor. And then several other companies are subcontracting various components and parts, because this is going to be all built in Japan. And then in 1968, we see the contract officially inked and going ahead. And then in March of 69, the design is locked down, ready for production. Again, mostly by Mitsubishi, but Fuji is actually doing quite a bit of work itself. So they start building the prototype. They roll it out at the end of April 1971, and it first takes to the sky July of that same year. And from that point, the contract had renamed the TX to the XT-2, and after the first successful test flights, they had a total of 4 prototypes. They would officially select it for service in August of 1973, dropping the X and it becoming the T-2. Originally, they were going to order as many as 200, but because of various budget cuts and other things happening, this was ultimately reduced to 90 aircraft and 2 main variants. And the first production models would be received by the JASDF in 1975 and start to see official squadron service in 76. And then between that time and 1980, various training units and other types, including the Blue Impulse, would start switching over. And production would last through about 1988, 87, 88, in that time frame. So much like with the F4, they weren't building a ton of them, but, slow and steady batches. So, what do we have here? And really, is it a Jaguar clone or not? The Japanese insist it only looks like a Jaguar because it was built for the same requirements. And if you look closely, or not even that closely, it's very different. And they're not wrong. Now, I will say it uses the same Rolls-Royce Adder turbofan engines, 2 of them, as the Jaguar. However, these are licensed produced in Japan, or were, so there's no illegality there. And just by having the same power plant, you are going to have a lot of the same features of the aircraft. The power plant really does set that going. We have an overall length of almost 59 feet, so she's long, but a wingspan of under 26 feet. The Japanese kind of consider this to have a bit of a dart shape, much more so than the Jaguar. It's mostly aluminum, but they did use a little bit of titanium, something they're newly working with in Japan. And since the Japanese did not require short airfield takeoff and landing, it didn't have the double landing gear like the Jaguar. So just typical tricycle, single gear, what have you. It was capable of reaching Mach 1.6, so pretty fast for a trainer, and an altitude of about 50,000 feet, again, sufficient for a trainer. Now, was it armed? Well, yes and no. The first 28 built, known as the T2Z, were not armed. They did have hard points under the wings and fuselage for fuel tanks. I should point out that there are no fuel tanks in the wings themselves. They're too small and narrow. So, from the get-go, there were hard points for attaching tanks. But the first 28 didn't have any kind of weapons. But then they would switch over for the next 62 built to the T2K. I should also point out that 2 of the 4 prototypes were also built to this standard. And these could, in theory, mount weapons, including a 20mm M61A1 cannon, although I don't know how many actually got it. They had a centerline hardpoint. They had a hardpoint under each wing, and each wing tip could take a short-range air-to-air missile like an AIM-9. So, in theory, it could be armed up, but in practice, this never happened. It was just more of an auxiliary thing, or maybe to do it for training purposes. It also had a radar, whereas the T2Z did not. But in all other ways, the avionics were essentially the same. For example, this had a heads-up display, which was actually French in origin, but again, it was made in Japan under license. It also had 0-0 ejection seats, something I'm sure the crew appreciated. It had types of autopilot, not complete, but for that day and time, quite good. It had your usual radio, friend or foe, transponders, stuff like that. So it was pretty well appointed, because this was considered an advanced trainer, not a basic one. So a little more oomph for your buck. So yeah, was it a Jaguar copy? Even though it's very similar in profile, not really. The systems are different, and the few that really were copied were produced under license. In fact, all the components were officially made in Japan, even if some were licensed from abroad, which gave Japanese industry even more of a heads up in design, and also working with more advanced avionics, cockpit electronics, heads up display, like I said, using titanium, basically just building a true supersonic craft for the first time without really much assistance. That's why it was kind of a slow and steady process, taking about a decade to go into service. But that's okay. So, yeah, these would be the primary advanced trainer for the F104 when they didn't have F104 DJs available, and also the F4, because this came around the same time that was coming into service, and it allowed retirement of some older and wearing out trainers. And even though it was designed to do several things, luckily for the Japanese, it never got to that point, so they were able just to deploy it for what it was. I do like the lines of this aircraft. It's quite sharp. And this Hobbymaster release did not have underwing fuel tanks. In fact, the hard points are filled in with the blocks that they use. So it's just as you see it here. Of course, the instructors in the back, trainees in the front. So, did it end here? Of course not. Although, it almost did. So, we move from the Mitsubishi T2 to this. And, if it looks very similar, just with more bits stuck on the bottom, that was exactly the point. With the F1, this was meant to be a minimum change operation. And it worked. And of course, it helped that it was always intended, at least hoped, that this could be converted into a single-seat fighter. What's interesting is this is a ground attack fighter, really showing a change. And it almost didn't happen. And, historically speaking, this was the first fighter aircraft designed and built in Japan since World War II. As with the T2, the F1 was a joint project between Mitsubishi and Fuji, although Mitsubishi would be the primary contractor. We already talked about the leading up to this and the hopes. Well, when the T2 finally took to the skies and production was ordered, it was overrun. The budget it cost more than they hoped for, changing tides. It looked like in 71, the planned for, the hoped for SFX-1 would be axed. But in 72, the government announced that plans to turn the two-seat T2 into a single-seat fighter would go ahead. And in 1973, the contract was signed and kind of worked out. They're trying to keep it as cheap as possible. In fact, for the prototypes, they actually took a couple of the T2 frames and reworked them to the initial F1s, which were initially called the FS-T2 Kai for added extra, plus some translate as upgrade. But it's really like extra plus, more to it. And so they would go from there, and they would work on the prototypes. In 1975, they would roll out in March of that year and take to the sky that June or July. Sources argue a bit. Either way, they flew in the summer of 75. And then production would ramp up, and they would start being delivered to Japanese JASDF squadrons in 1978, early around April of that year. And it would take a little time to switch over. And even though they planned to buy 160, which would have been enough to re-equip multiple squadrons, because of budget cuts yet again in the late 70s and changing economics, they only built 77, including the 2 prototypes. That didn't really leave them with enough of the now designated F1 to really do something. Although it did let them retire some very much aging F-86 Sabres and a few other odds and ends, and of course it would join the F-4 Phantom and this kind of next generation of Japanese jets. So what did they do to the T2 to make it the F1 here? All the basic specs of the airframe are the same. The biggest difference is with the cockpit, the canopy. They took the second seat out and they just fared over kind of a opaque clamshell over the top there, and this was turned into an avionics bay. Because we had, of course, more fire control systems, an uprated radar, we still have the heads-up display. It's actually an all-digital cockpit now. And we have more fuel, a little bit inside, because the original T2 didn't have much, and even with that, the F1 was always known for kind of not having enough fuel for 2 engines going, 1.5 times the speed of sound. And the 20mm Gatling gun, which was optional for the T2 and the gunnery trainer version, was made standard here with 750 rounds. And we would add an extra hard point under each wing for a total of 7. And it could roughly 5,500 pounds, but if it did that, it would severely limit its range, endurance, and all that good stuff. This is with the T2. The inner hard points on the wings were plumbed, as was the center line, but those are also the strongest hard points, so if you wanted to carry heavier ordnance, you needed those. The wingtip rails were reserved for short-range air-to-air missiles, and then the outboard underwing pylons were lighter ordnance, although it could carry an additional 2 air-to-air missiles there. but it never carried medium or long range air-to-air, just short range for air patrol and defense only. Because it was a ground attacker. Well, sort of. It started off in the 60s. They wanted a maritime patrol vessel and anti-shipping. So in the beginning, the F-1's primary weapon system was the ASM-1, long-range heavy anti-shipping missile. Later, it would be replaced and serviced by the ASM-2, an improved variant. Think of it as the Harpoon, the AGM-84 Harpoon, or if you prefer, the AM-39 Exocet, made famous in the Falklands War. That's a French one. You can understand why a nation like Japan, especially with Cold War tensions and rising influence of China, and even some North Korean shenanigans, would maybe want an anti-shipping plane. But it's interesting because this is the first time they're breaking away from the air-to-air only. Now, granted, the F-86 had some very limited ground attack abilities, but that's totally dumb bombs. Interestingly, while the Japanese had AIM-9Bs, the F-1 was sometimes fitted, especially early on, with the AAM-1, which was a Japanese sort of copy of the AIM-9B, but slightly larger, slightly less effective, and definitely more expensive. These were also fielded on the F-86Fs that had the upgrade after 59 for a while, and on the F-104 Starfighter too. But their mounting was pretty much interchangeable with sidewinders. They would enter into service in the very early 70s and be used through the mid-80s. They wouldn't build a ton of them, a few hundred. And you'll see a lot of AIM-9Bs and later AIM-9Ls kind of flying with them, because it was Japan trying to develop its own industry here. Kind of what we've seen. And that does get us to this aircraft. This was their first supersonic jet fighter, sometimes called the Supersonic Raihisen, as a nickname or whatever, homage. But they never had enough, and again, very short endurance. But it gave them a new capability over the oceans and also over the land. Here we have more of a ground patrol version. The F-1 could carry the Mark 82 500-pound bomb, as well as the Mark 117 750-pound bomb. Like I said, it also could carry external tanks, and it could carry various rocket pods, typically 2.75-inch 70mm pods, and a few other things besides. This one has the other type of missile on the wingtip there, used later on, or intermittently. This was designed, and this is more of the close air support role, patrol role, coming in to help troops with rockets if needed. Unfortunately, even though it had on paper 7 hard points, if you wanted to have fuel tanks, that would take up 1 to 3, and you really needed that for close air support, the endurance. And the wingtips were really only useful for the air-to-air defense missiles, meaning you only had 2 to 4 wing hard points, and if you loaded them both down, it only had your 1 center-on fuel tank. Again, very short duration. Kind of seeing the problem here? But again, this was still a lot of their first, and the anti-shipping, I think, was more important to them in the very beginning. But the ground attack did kind of come about. We would even see some infrared guided air-to-surface ordnance, thanks to some avionics upgrades and new bomb fitments. So it had some guiding possibilities outside of the ASM-1, ASM-2. And certainly using the AIM-9L Sidewinder, which came about in the early 80s, improved things, which was really about when this was coming in. Production would last, again, relatively small batch runs through March of 1987. That's when the last ones were shipped from the Mitsubishi factory. I don't want to say it was a failure. It gave them an interesting ability as a just-in-case thing, but they never had enough. So, yeah, the ones they had were flown a lot, and they were only rated for about 3,500 flight hours. In 1991, a program was begun to give them a service life extension upgrade. The airframe had already been strengthened to carry the extra ordnance. It was further refurbished and beefed up. They improved the cockpit avionics a bit, give it a little bit more modern guiding and tracking systems. But even with all this, the program lasted from 91 to 93. They took 70 of the lower hour aircraft, so nearly the entire fleet. Gave them this. It only bumped up their acceptable flight hours to about 4,000, so another 500 flight hours. So the clock was always ticking for the Mitsubishi F1. And at the time, it was Japan's only real anti-shipping and close air support ground attack aircraft. At least it was produced and domestically designed and made. Finally, though, by 2003, they started pulling some out of service as they reached the end of their service lives. And then in March of 2006, the last half a dozen or so were finally pulled as they hit that magic 4K mark, and that was it. And with the F1 retired, even though the T2 was useful for training in other aircraft, they too were kind of hitting the end of their flight lives. Only 90 of those had been built, and they were built earlier. So they decided to retire both the T2 and the F1 in spring of 2006. Again, they really enjoy retiring aircraft in Japan in the spring. Or I guess technically late winter. Anyway, interesting plane. And I like the looks of this Dart. Cool model from Hobby Master. I like aircraft with the anti-shipping missiles. Unfortunately, when you have them on the stand, it takes up the center line hard point where I think these came with Mark 82 cluster bombs. Anyway, what should we look at next? Let's move out of the venerable third generation of jet fighters into the fourth in the 1980s, and the F-15 Eagle, or the Japanese variant, the F-15J. And actually, the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force is the largest user of the F-15, not counting the USA. And it was one of the earliest. And believe it or not, these aircraft have seen a lot of flight time, a lot of intercepts. Some of them have actually been run ragged. But we'll get there. It's more of a 21st century story. Yet again, we're back with the Hobby Master. And this is your typical F-15J single seat air superiority fighter. The Navy had the F-14 Tomcat, and the Air Force had this bird, which is a fun story in and of itself. But we're here to talk about Japan. So, the year is 1975. The Vietnam War is over, at least for the US, and Japan now is getting more and more F-4 Phantoms, and it's time to look to retire the F-104 Starfighter. What to do? Well, some people take a summer vacation, go to the beach, relax. The Japanese, well, basically Defense Ministry, previous name, decided to spend the summer in the US looking at jet aircraft. Frankly, that's my kind of vacation. They looked at 13, because that's a lucky number, different models, including the F-15. They were really shopping around. This needed to replace the F-104 and free up some F-4s for other duties. And basically just give superiority. Put them on top. Because China is becoming more of a threat after time of troubles and everything over there. And the Soviet Union is starting to rattle the saber a bit as time goes on too. So they need something to run patrol missions, endurance, and just, beat the crap out of everything. They look at the single-seat F-15 and the twin-seat F-15 at Edwards Air Force Base, and in December of '75, that's what they decide they're going to go with. Of course, they want to customize it a bit, but not as much as before because, you know, the old adage, not a pound for air to ground. That's sort of true with the F-15. It always had the ability to drop Mark 82 bombs and some cluster munitions. That was okay. Interestingly, for the first time, as far as I can remember, the aerial refueling was left intact. Could just be, you know, where it was. So everything is going swimmingly. In 1978, orders get placed. A deal is signed between Mitsubishi and McDonnell Douglas. All's going well. They're hoping to purchase about 187. They want both the single seat to use as a fighter interceptor, air superiority fighter, and the twin seat not only to use as a trainer, but also to use as a fighter in and of itself. Kind of a, you know, de facto air command. Whenever you get two guys, it's always good. More going on. But anywho, they run into some problems in 1980. The U.S. government, the Department of Defense, still at the end of the Carter administration, decides it doesn't want to release the new technology. It's one thing to sell F-15s, but they want to assemble them, build them in Japan, and they're not keen on releasing some of the electronic warfare, electronic defenses, early warning systems, even the Pratt & Whitney F-100 engines. They're just not keen on this. So a compromise is hit upon where that McDonnell Douglas will basically make the parts in the U.S. and then Mitsubishi will do assembly in Japan. So that's kind of what we're going with. And from there, the first prototype, the first two of these would be built, assembled, and test flown in the USA under the auspices of the U.S. Air Force. The first test flight of an F-15J would be June 4, 1980, and then in July there would be the first flight over to Japan just to kind of, you know, work it out. And then after building the first two examples and kind of submitting them for Japanese testing and approval, McDonnell Douglas would assemble 8 kits and send them over, and the first of those would be received in Japan August 1981. And because they enjoy the ironic dating system, this was entered into Japanese Air Self-Defense Service December 7, 1981. So exactly 40 years after a certain event. I guess no hard feelings, right? And later that month, the first squadron would begin training up with these. And in 1982, they would nominally enter service, and more squadrons will train up in 83 and 84, partially in response to perceived aggressions from Russia and China, especially Russia at this time. And this would allow the F-104 Starfighter to be retired out completely, a few other old aircraft, and it would free up some F-4 Phantoms on the front line. The F-4 is a great aircraft, but it is Generation 3. This, at the time, was cutting edge, Gen 4. You know the F-15 Eagle, but just for fun, let's go over it real quick. She's not small. Not quite 64 feet long, wingspan of roughly 43 feet. 2, like I said, Pratt & Whitney engines. They can get her up to Mach 2.5 or greater at high altitudes, and she's still supersonic at low altitudes, about Mach 1.2, maybe 1.3. And probably one of the highest altitude aircraft Japan's ever flown, able to climb up to 65,000 feet, maybe even more. Single seat or twin seat, of course, radar. Some of the Japanese equipment would be different because of the technology arrangement with the U.S. Other stuff, they just wanted their own equipment. For example, their data link system they would use in these was different from what America had. But by and large, pretty well the same bird. Had a 20mm M61 cannon and carried on average 8 missiles and 3 drop tanks. The U.S. aircraft would have the AIM-9 Sidewinder and the AIM-7 Sparrow, of course the most up-to-date versions in the 80s. And Japan would start there. But the plan was to actually go to an indigenous missile design for short range as soon as they could. The AAM1, the AM1 didn't work out. We talked about that. The AM2 was interesting. It was actually to be an improved, expanded AIM-4D Falcon. While it did enter into the testing phase, it was never put into production. So their next hope would be the AAM3, which this aircraft is wearing here. But those were not introduced into service until 1990, which is why they're called the Type 90 missile. So for the first nearly decade of this being in Japanese service, it was using AIM-9 Sidewinders on the wings and AIM-7 Sparrows underneath. Again, combined with advanced radar systems for the day and time, and it's an Eagle. You get it. And of course, it had the bigger fuel tanks, including the one underneath, giving it quite good range, plus the fuel tanks inside. Just a really neat aircraft. How many of these did they get? Well, I don't know. Sources really argue. Even the Wikipedia article contradicts itself not once, not twice, but 4 times. It said that originally they wanted 187, both models combined. It said that 139 were assembled in Japan by Mitsubishi, at least as the prime contractor, but plus the 2 more built in USA. But then it's also said that they're flying 155 of the F-15J. And it's also said that they have 203, 213, 223, with 203 of those being the J. Now, I understand that some have been lost to crashes, accidents, and just timing out. So, 155 in service now, sure, but I don't know. Sorry. I've looked for years, and you can look it up and let me know. But either way, quite a large number. And by the mid and late 80s, they were quite prevalent. And that would actually lead to the U.S. loosening the technology purse strings in 86, 87, and allowing a multiple-step upgrade program, sometimes referred to as the F-15MJ, where they would get better electronics, upgraded engines, a newer radar system, just all kinds of mostly internal changes to make this a better bird. And most of the Japanese aircraft, well over 100, would get this, but not all, interestingly. And the whole fleet wasn't. They would run into some budgetary concerns later on. But yeah, this was their frontline fighter, interceptor. And unlike the F-104, it could actually dogfight. As could this version, the F-15DJ. Fully combat capable, in some instances maybe even more so than the single seat, because you've got a backseater, a RIO, or a weapons officer, or whichever, if you're Navy or Air Force, or whatever you want to call them. You've got a guy that can dedicate his full attention to the radar, the weapons, and he's about as smart as a pilot, too. In fact, a lot of backseaters, depending on different times in history, were fully qualified pilots. Other times they were specialists, but it just depends when and where you're at. It also could serve as, like I said, an aerial kind of de facto command post, control post, having a guy in the back. The Russians do this with their Su-30s. This one doesn't have the Sparrows underneath. Some could. It just has the AAM-3s on the wings, plus the tanks. One thing I like about the Hobbymaster stand for the F-15 is it does still allow for the centerline tank, because the F-15, it needs that big old, what is it, like 630 gallon, 650? It's a big one. And the ones on the wings are just as big. And what's nice is the way this is designed, you're not really losing much, because in the single seat, the back seat is just kind of ferruled over for equipment and whatnot. So the guy in the back doesn't require the nose to be extended. It's not as hodgepodge. You can tell it was designed to be there. How many of these do they have? Well, we do know that 12 were built for Japan in the U.S. by McDonnell Douglas. The rest were put together in Japan from kits. How many? 8? 20? 25? 35? 37? I've seen all these numbers. I don't know. Anyway, a couple of dozen, to 2 to 4 dozen, whatever. They had some, and they actually, didn't just use them for training, although they definitely did. They were used for combat missions, patrol missions, and just keeping the pilots sharp. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. If I could go up in the sky on an F-15 for work, I'd do it. But after 87 through 90s, several aircraft did get updates to their countermeasures, their communication systems, keeping them kind of at the edge of the spear. And again, production would continue through 97. And relations, well, they were never bad between the U.S. and Japan, improved after the mid to late 80s. And so the U.S. was more willing to share technology. This really is the same as an F-15D, frankly, with a lot of the same upgrades and technology sharings. And now there was talk throughout the 21st century of updating these. Beginning in 2003, 2004, there were plans to update these to fire the new AAM-4, which is a medium beyond visual range missile. It required a new sighting device for the pilot. In more recent times, there's even talk of retrofitting these to work with the AAM-5, which is an update and replacement of the AAM-3. The AAM-4 would replace the Sparrow, but the 5 would replace the 3. But it's hard to say what really happens, because they'll get plans together and then the government will change. They'll say they're updating 100, then it gets knocked down. At one point in 2010, they were down to say they were only going to update 10 aircraft. On the other hand, different government programs said they wanted to do 48 different changes and updates to the fleet. So, okay, there's even plans to do an RF-15 series, giving it a photo reconnaissance and surveillance role. Interestingly, that was axed. The government decided in 2009 to focus just on the F-15 fighter. And then, 2018, Japan talked about selling roughly 100 of the oldest aircraft back to the U.S., kind of as store credit, to pick up some of those new fancy F-35s. Mostly A's, but some B's too, because who doesn't like a Transformer? I don't know if that's really happening, though, because the F-35's had an interesting path in Japan so far, and let's face it, the F-15, while it is aging, it is 4th generation, not stealthy. It's faster, has a heavier weapons payload, better endurance, and it's pretty damn infinitely upgradable. Look at the new F-15X series. So in 2019, there was talk about updating 100 to a new standard, kind of called, I think it's called the Super Interceptor or something like that. In 2022, so last year, the Japanese government confirmed that 68 lower airframe hours, F-15Js and presumably DJs too, would be updated, kind of a midlife refurbishment program. New, better computers, upgraded engines, the usual stuff, modern electronics, compatibility with newer weapons systems, maybe even some guided air-to-surface munitions. There's been talk about the AGM-154 for years going on these. So even though money was allocated and that said that was going to happen, I don't know if that's actually taken to the sky yet. Some of these upgraded versions have periodically been known as the F-15J Kai for, upgraded plus extra, like we've talked about for other things. It will be very interesting to see the fleet. It does seem like they might sell off the older members to the U.S. so they can refurbish them and then move them along to third parties, and then keep 50 to 70 flying themselves with the planned service life into the 2030s. And as the F-35 continues to, I don't want to disparage it. A lot of people do that, and it does have attributes, but let's be honest, the F-15 does too. But I guess we'll see. I just found it really interesting. This has served 7 squadrons fly the F-15 or recently have, plus a couple of training squadrons and research squadrons. So, it's pretty widespread use within Japan. I just don't see that dying out anytime soon, considering how much they've invested time and money into these. But I could be very wrong. They could be out next year. Who knows? But Japan seems to hang on to things when they like them. You notice that. And with that somewhat awkward transition, let's revisit the good old Samurai Phantom, the F-4EJ. Or rather, its Kai variants. Forgive me if I keep my hand on this. I really like these new Hobby Master stands, but I wish they were weighted. Caliber Wings and a few others do a weighted base one, and it's just nice to have that. But I like these because you can have the full underbelly ordnance. This is the F-4EJ Kai. Mitsubishi turned out the last F-4EJ in 1981, bringing the total up to 140, and that could have been the end of it. But a few things happened. For one, the F1, while not a failure, was not ever produced in enough numbers to suit the needs. For another, politics were changing. What the JASDF, the JSDF for that matter, wanted changed. What the government wanted, the US's position, things were changing. All of this resulted in this program and the first test flight of an updated model, July 1984. The Kai basically restores a lot of features. For one, it has the 20mm cannon. It has an improved radar in every way in the nose. It's lighter, smaller. It's a pulse Doppler. It's true look down and shoot down. And not only does it have air-to-air capabilities, it has air-to-ground for the first time. Mostly things like the Mark 82. But really what was important to them, much like with the F1, was the ASM-1, later ASM-2 anti-shipping missile. So that's what this could carry. And generally it was just updated. It had new early warning systems. It had a heads-up display in the cockpit for the pilot. Just, quality of life improvements. And since the F-15 was coming in to be the new air superiority fighter, that left the F-4 available to be the new fighter/fighter bomber. Ironically, the thing that the F-100 was kicked out for decades earlier. But again, times change. Originally they were going to update as many as 120, but because of budgets and some of them had high hours, it was decided eventually to update 96. They had 129 available in the fleet, so most of them are still existing at this time. Of course, some of them are only a few years old. So they would update 96 candidates, and this would officially enter into JASDF service November 1989. And in 1990 they would kind of decide how many they were going to update and what to do with them, and they would start sending them in, updating them, swapping them out. At the same time, like I said, at their height, 7 squads flew the Phantom. Many were starting to switch over to the F-15 and eventually other aircraft too. So as early as 1994, strength in the Japanese Air Force would start to draw down, but they still had almost 100 in service by 2007. And when I say 100, I mean all variants. I will point out before I move on with this model, it does have the AAM-3s under the wings. It does not have provisions for the outboard fuel tanks because of when this was based. This was a 2003 example. It does have the improved centerline tank. It's actually taken from the F-15, so it's slightly larger. It's a little bit more fuel, but really where it helps the aircraft is it has better performance in the air. It does better at high Mach, and it does better at high G. It's stressed to a higher rating. so it doesn't impact the aircraft's performance as much. Gives it a teeny bit more fuel, and of course it gives it the common fuel with the fuel tank with the F-15 in service. All around a good idea. A lot of countries started putting F-15 tanks on the F-4. So the update program lasted mostly up through about 93, about which time they were done. And a few squadrons were flying them. This was, again, their ground attack, their close air support, and yes, it could even be used for long-range anti-shipping missions, because it could carry up to 3 tanks and modern missiles, at least for the day and time. And it still carried the AIM-7 Sparrow, although a different variant than the one on the F-15, as you can imagine. The venerable old samurai Phantom. And you might think that's the end of the story. Well, not quite. There is one more chapter to mention. Meet the RF-4EJ, the final major member of our family. And before we talk about modern times, let's go back to the 1970s. The U.S. Air Force flew the RF-4C as a reconnaissance. The Navy Marines had the RF-4B. The RF-4E was actually intended for export customers. Israel used them, amongst others. Very similar, but it had some technology changes for export. And Japan was still using the old RF-86Fs in the early 70s. It only was flying one squadron, the 501st Legion, under Lord Vader, for reconnaissance. And really needed to do something new. So then they purchased 14 of the brand new RF-4E, aircraft from McDonnell Douglas, and they were delivered between November 1974 and July 1975. These were unarmed photo reconnaissance. They had the camera in the nose. Pretty similar to everything else. And they formed a squadron. 14 was enough for a full squadron plus a few extras. And that would be their photo reconnaissance ability for, well, a decade. But when the Kai program came in the mid-80s, the reconnaissance aircraft was not forgotten. 11 of the 14 RF-4Es were updated to the RF-4E Kai standard. Externally, not a lot of difference, but they did get a new radar, new digital processing for photographs, newer avionics systems, much the same as the rest. Also, while they were at it, they didn't convert all of the F-4EJs. So they looked at 29 of the unconverted aircraft, and they picked the 15 best candidates to update them to a new standard called the RF-4EJ. So they basically turn regular aircraft into photo reconnaissance. As far as I know, these actually retain the ability to carry weapons. They didn't have the camera nose, but they did carry a wide range of pods on the underside, as did the RF-4E Kai. This one has one camera pod on it. And what's really neat about the Hobbymaster model, you don't just get the one pod. You also get a somewhat more conventional one here. And an electronic here. So you get the LOROP pod, the Taser pod, and I forget the other one right now. Plus you've got the electronic device on the wing there too. So we definitely need our external fuel tanks on the wing so we can have a pod in the middle. This is a very flexible aircraft. It can carry multiple types of pods, do multiple surveillance, even doing infrared, electronic warfare to some extent, oblique or straightforward photography, says the blind guy. And at least the converted F-4EJs could theoretically carry armament, but I don't know if they ever did, frankly. But yeah, a squadron would fly these, and in 2006-2007, including the reconnaissance and the fighter versions, there were about 90 in JASDF service. And they'd actually been planning to retire them, but, well, they first wanted to get the F-22 Raptor from the U.S., but the U.S. decided not to clear that for export, never has. Then they were interested in the Eurofighter Typhoon. That program hit a road bump. And then they decided to retire the RF-4Es and give their pods to the F-15. But like we said, that wasn't allowed. So they kind of got stuck using them for a long time. All their attempts to replace them didn't really work out. Finally, in 2011, they picked the F-35 Lightning as their new aircraft. I'm sure nothing will go wrong. And this resulted in a drawdown where you ended up with 3, then 2 squadrons, the reconnaissance, and 1 tactical fighter squadron left. And in 2019, the end is nigh. In March of 2020, because you know they like retiring things in March, the RF-4s took their final flight. And then March of 2021, the sole remaining squadron of tactical fighters took its final flight. And one kind of cool story, in that during the final flight, the original, very first Japanese F-4EJ flew. It actually, this aircraft over here, made it the whole time and flew at the very end. It was the first and the last to fly. It was in the flight of, I believe, 4 aircraft and made it through. But yeah, the photo reconnaissance really was a vast improvement over the old RF-86F Sabres. And, well, they were getting dated at the end. They made the most out of their Phantoms. They got their money's worth out of these, huh? Can't say otherwise. Oh, the F-4EJs that weren't picked to convert to one or the other, they were just retired and scrapped. I think a couple of them are put in a museum or kept for testing purposes, but the remaining, dozen or so were just retired. I'm sure some of them had some airframe fatigue issues anyway. So that's kind of the story there. But you've noticed we've had the F1 and the T2. We talked about that. But we haven't had a trainer in a minute. The F-15, the updated F-4. I think it's time for a trainer. A little trainer. Meet the Kawasaki T4. One of the neatest little models Hobbymaster has done. And honestly, one of the best case scenarios for requiring, designing, developing, testing, and producing a military-grade aircraft. This just went well and was a very good little plane. In fact, this probably would have been a good export for Kawasaki/Japan if their laws had not forbade them to export military hardware abroad. So these are only made for the JASDF again. But they have been and are still in service today, quite a successful little trainer. This is classed as a medium or intermediate level trainer, and it is subsonic. Interestingly, its specs are not too far removed from the old T-33 and T1s, but part of that's kind of what it was designed to replace. Around 1980, with the F-15 coming into service, or at least coming in very soon, the F-4 firmly in service, and the F-33 aging, and the T-33 aging, and the T1, anyway. And the T2 doing well, but again, not a huge number of those, and that's a supersonic thing. A need for a subsonic basic trainer was really felt. It needed to be simple, dependable, low maintenance, easy to fly, maneuverable, just a really forgiving aircraft, and cheap. Yeah, budget overruns. Like I said, the F1 nearly didn't exist because of budgets, and they just bought a bunch of F-15s. So, yeah, we need something new. It needs to have good handling, maneuverability, but don't kill the pilots. Don't be like the F-104 DJ. So, Fuji and Mitsubishi submitted design proposals, but it was actually Kawasaki that would be picked in 1981 with their proposal initially known as the KA-850, and this whole program was known as the MTX, for basically Modernized Trainer Experimental. From there, Kawasaki would slowly but surely be working up their design, and it would become the XT4 1984, and it would fly at the end of June 1985 and enter into a very leisurely, calm testing phase that lasted over 2.5 years. The first production model, T4, would fly almost 3 years later in 1988 and was very, very similar to the prototype, which is generally a good thing. I think they made four prototypes. They initially projected they were going to make 200 of these. Then, because things were going so well, and they decided to do 120. Well, they ended up building 208 production models and 4 prototypes. And they wanted to have this in service by 1988, and guess what? They did. It was entered into the JASDF September of 1988, so with some time to spare. And they needed it cheap and budget. And guess what? It did. It came in on time and on budget. Not something that happens anymore at all. So, between 1989 and 1992, a lot of units would switch over, training units, and production would last until 1996. So, 8 years building just over 200 planes. But it's a simple little bird. Uses the Japanese F3 engine, 2 of them. Dependable, solid, easy to work on engine. And unlike the T2, there was never a combat version made. This was just meant to be a trainer, and it did it damn well. It's small too, under 43 feet long, wingspan of under 33 feet, crew of 2 of course. Then the cockpit's the biggest part of the aircraft. Top speed is under 650 miles per hour, so yeah. And altitude about 49,000 feet. But it was maneuverable and a very gentle handler, easy to land, take off. It had 2 hard points, one under each wing. In theory, you could put something there aggressive, but in practice, they were only ever used for fuel tanks. And in 1995, the Blue Impulse team selected this as their next performance aircraft and started doing shows with it in 1996, so they trained up on it quite quickly. That's about it. This allowed them to retire the T-33, especially after the accident, the remaining T-1s, and it supplemented the T-2s. It didn't replace the T-2s, but when the T-4 would work, it was more fuel efficient. So, yeah, why not fly this? And then, of course, after this, they could graduate to the F-15DJ or what have you. But yeah, it's just a neat little aircraft. And unlike the T2 that could be mistaken for a Jaguar, this somewhat resembles a British Hawk. But since it's a twin-engine design, nah, not really. Pretty uniquely Japanese. And it's nice to see Kawasaki kind of back in the airplane game, since they were one of the early contenders. I think they just have a knack for making simple, dependable trainers. They should make a Cessna clone. But yeah, nothing real special, but it is kind of one of my favorite little hobby masters. I like it when they do oddball planes like this. when they did the T2 mold tooling, they could do the F1. But making the T4, this tooling's only good for this, and there's not a ton of variations. They can't do armed up versions and all that. But to be fair, here we are in 2023, and this is still being used as a trainer in the JASDF today. So, hope you enjoyed that nice, soothing, everything's going well story. Because our next story, it ain't so smooth. All those good times and good feelings of the T4, well, put them away, because it's time to talk about the Mitsubishi / Lockheed Martin F2, often called the Viper Zero, which I gotta admit is one of the coolest names ever. And if at first this kind of resembles an F-16, you're not incorrect, but really under the hood, it isn't. Although the initial design was actually a proposal from General Dynamics, the Agile Falcon, that the US did not pick up on. We'll get there. But first, before we can even talk about the tech specs, by the way, this is an F2B in more of a training mode from Hobby Master, we have to talk about everyone's favorite politics, which is why The Phantom Menace is everyone's favorite Star Wars film, right? Going all the way back to 1980, 1981, the F1 is entering service, but many are skeptical. Anyway, it was always kind of meant to be an interim measure. Again, we're leapfrogging Japanese design development industry. The F-15J is coming in. The F-4EJ is about to have its life extension program with the KAI. The idea is we need something to replace the F1, since it's not going to be available in enough numbers. But there's not a lot of urgency, and they start to realize, 82, 83, that really the F1, along with some updated F4s, can kind of fill the role. So it's not as bad as they thought. Nevertheless, in 85, a design study was conducted, and many in Japan wanted to go with an indigenous design. Others, though, wanted to shop around to foreign markets. And for the time being, these kind of won out. By the way, the name of this program is the FSX, for basically Fighter Strike Experimental. And the primary goal is the anti-shipping, just as with the F1, with the ground attack, close support, air superiority, air-to-air as a secondary. And they're initially interested in the US F-16, F-18, and Europe's, at the time, quite new Tornado. So they sent out requests, they take a look, and then they say, look, you can't give us what we need. They wanted it to be able to carry not 2, as on the F1, but up to 4 of the ASM-1, later ASM-2 anti-shipping missiles, plus at least 2 short-range air-to-air missiles like the AIM-9 or AAM-3 for defense. And it needed a round-trip range of 450, 500 miles at least, plus several other requirements. These are really considered to be unrealistic, so much so that the US, Germany, West Germany, and Italy actually sued Japan, and this kind of would lead to effectively a recount. In the spring of '86, they decided to reevaluate, and what they offered to the companies is, don't just show us what you have, design a variant for our needs. And the Tornado would be the first to drop out. So it's down to the FA-18 and then the F-16. But then General Dynamics kind of dusts off something they'd had in the archives for a couple of years, the Agile Eagle, which was basically a large wing version of the F-16C single seat or F-16D two-seater. And this larger wing could give space for more fuel and the ability to carry 6 to 8 external stores, air-to-air missiles for defense, plus 4 air-to-surface anti-shipping missiles, drop tanks, extra, So this is, looking like the way they want to go. And in fact, in October of 1987, it looks like this is the direction. General Dynamics and Mitsubishi are going to partner together. There was talk of doing a 45-55 split, with the 55% cost and labor going to Japan, 45 being taken up by General Dynamics. But there's a problem. Politics in Washington, D.C., because there was a bit of a scandal. As you might imagine, in the 1980s, there were several restrictions and sanctions on what could be sold to communist Soviet Russia. Well, as it turns out, the Japanese company Toshiba didn't pay much heed. So, ramping up around May and running through the summer and really hitting a fever pitch in the fall of '87, the so-called Toshiba Kongsberg scandal took hold. And this was everyone's talking about in Washington, D.C. And it kind of put Japan in the doghouse because of this. And keep in mind, the U.S. had been pushing for Japan to partner for the F-16. It was kind of felt like it would give closer ties. That was the reason given. Others, more cynical, said it would give the U.S. a look at what Japanese technology was up to. Either way, the U.S. wanted to keep a partnership going. After all, the F-4, the F-15, so on and so forth. So they kind of pushed Japan in there. But now Japan's in a weaker position as we move into 1988 in D.C. So there was finally a memorandum of understanding signed between General Dynamics and Mitsubishi in November of 1988. And the final split will be 60-40. 60% falling on Japan, 40% on General Dynamics. And we are dusting off the Agile Falcon. The version kind of tailored by Mitsubishi was for a brief time known as the XS-3 as part of the FS-X program as the actual submittal. And so this would, pretty much be the way they're going to go. And so they were really working on things, but then the administration changes. January of '89, Reagan is out, and his former VP, Bush, is in. And in January, he immediately calls for a review and quote-unquote clarification of this agreement with Mitsubishi. This is not popular. Many in Congress want to just abrogate it completely. And in Japan, it's viewed as the U.S. trying to use leverage, use its position to renegotiate better terms for itself. Many in the U.S. counter that this partnership will give Japan access to cutting-edge technology involving the F-16 and other things, giving them a heads up. Kind of the reverse of what was hoped earlier for the U.S. to maybe sneak peek into what Japan was up to. It's a bunch of back and forth. Regardless, a revised agreement is penned in April of that year, and then it is officially ratified by Congress in June, under duress, under protest. Congress publicly and vehemently makes their displeasure unknown. And many in the Japanese government and even military follow suit. So actually they're in agreement that they both sides hate it, which, yeah, that sounds like any compromise in politics I've ever heard of. No one's happy. And just salt in the wound, turns out the new aircraft is actually going to be more expensive than just a standard F-16C or D. Then again, they wanted it to do more too. Regardless, the memorandum signed, agreements are approved, so by 1990 they take a chance to kind of update the avionics, the electronics with the newest stuff, and full steam ahead. And the production of this will actually involve a lot of companies. Mitsubishi is the prime contractor, but Kawasaki and Fuji in Japan will play major parts, and well, General Dynamics was supposed to, but in 1993 they were acquired and folded into Lockheed Martin, so now Lockheed Martin will provide several parts and assemblies and bits and bobs, and they have a lot to do with organizing the avionics. There's actually a big flap about the software package that I won't go into here, but yeah, regardless, they do start building the prototype in Nagoya, Japan, Mitsubishi's factory there, in 1994. It rolls out of the factory in January of 1995, and the first prototype, known as the XF-2A single-seat version, flies October 7, 1995. The second prototype, XF-2A again, single-seater, flies December 13 of that year. Then the next two prototypes, which are XF-2Bs, fly, those are the two-seaters, in 1996. So we have a total of 4 prototypes. There's also 2 static ground test models, which is, as we'll soon see, it's actually a really good thing they had them. And so we have 6 test models, 4 of which are flying. They're essentially fully operational. And the original plan is to pick up 141 of the new aircraft. Although this will quickly be reduced to 130. Actually, the 11 that were dropped were initially earmarked for the Blue Impulse flight team. So poor them. This is really when they're seeing the cost overruns. Kind of like with the F1, yeah, it's going up. But why? What's going on? Oh, and by the way, they were hoping to have these in service by 1999. So like I said, this version here is pretty stripped down and more of a training mode, with just the pylons visible. So let's talk about what the F2 is. I should say that flight testing would continue through 1997, and after it was over, the XF2s were redesignated as just F2s, and production lines were set up for serial production in 1998, and serial production was planned for and actually did begin in 1999. But in 2000, they had to put a halt because a bit of a major flaw was discovered with the wing, or rather the wing and frame material, because it was a little too advanced for the day and time. Which is an interesting thing to talk about. After all, Japanese industry wanted to push itself forward, and that and the radar and several other components certainly did that. So let's switch out our Hobbymaster models and kind of talk about some of the features. And I really do like this jet, even if it was mired in controversy for the first decade of its life. After all, it did deliver what Japan ordered. I didn't actually mean to show you another two-seater, but this one just fits so well. This is the original XF-2B, one of the 2 prototypes, later adopted into service as the F-2B. And it's armed up. Hobbymaster did 2 versions of this, one in more of a test mode, one in an armament mode here, and you can see a lot of gobbledygook sticking off of it. And that's kind of what this was designed for. Again, they were at least wanting 4 ASM-1s, 2s, plus 2 to 4 short-range air defense missiles, and tanks 2 to 3 for the extended range. So yeah, they had a lot going on. That's not even getting into the radar. So, what do we have here, and why were there problems? Let's just dive in. This has about a 20 to 25% larger wing than a standard F-16. It also has about the same increase in the tail and a larger air intake. And it has 13 hard points for carrying things, not counting even like the chin mounted. And it can carry a large amount of external fuel. In other words, it's still on a single General Electric F-110 engine, which is a good, powerful engine, and it is an upgraded version. But to keep performance and range and everything, what they decided to use was a kind of a graphite polymerized mix of fiberglass, or I should say fiber composite, for parts of the aircraft. As much as 18% of it is not metal, it's more of this composite. This had several advantages. For one, it saved on weight, 500 to 600 pounds. It also just improved handling and performance and allowed for the larger wing. And while it was certainly not stealthy, it actually did help reduce the radar return of the aircraft, and that's never a bad thing. But it was incredibly new technology. In fact, this was the first tactical fighter to ever be put into full production using this kind of composite material in critical areas. Luckily, using the two static ground test models in 99, 2000, they ID'd stress points and fatigue areas before this went into service. So even though it kind of caused a delay in production, better to do it then before they've cranked out a bunch of aircraft than later, not to mention putting pilots' lives at risk. And that's kind of where we're coming from. Now, after that, they did correct it in 2000. Production would resume, and it would have composite parts. So, what else? What makes this not an F-16? Beginning at the nose, this has a larger, wider radome, because this was the first production tactical jet also to have an ASA or ESA, I've heard people pronounce it both ways, an AESA, Active Electronic Scan Array radar system, which is, the next generation. We talked about the F4 having pulse Doppler. Well, this is the next step up. And later we'll see this technology even integrated into its missiles themselves, giving it an edge. Of course, today, several jets have an ESA or ASA radar, but back in 95, it was pretty good. The cockpit, the canopy itself, is actually reinforced to try to prevent or dissuade damage from bird strikes. Inside, the pilot has 3 multifunction displays, liquid crystal, plus a heads-up. Actually, the components there are provided by Japanese subcontractors. The radar itself was pioneered and produced by Mitsubishi. The back seat could either be a weapons officer or a pilot instructor, because the F-2B was fully combat capable. In fact, the original plan was to order 83 single seats and 47 two-seaters. So you don't order that many if you're not expecting to use them. Unfortunately, because of delays, cost overruns, by 2004, they made it clear that they weren't going to buy 130. Remember, it's already been reduced once. Okay? So, the first order that's already been stone is for 81 aircraft. They decide that we're going to stop at 98, including the 4 prototypes. So, honestly, 94 full production plus the 4 prototypes updated to production standard. The next contract would be signed for 5 aircraft in 2007, and then the third contract would be in 2008 for components to build 8 more, bringing the total up to 94. And try to think exactly how many were the 2-seater. I know there's at least 27, 28. I believe it was about 29 were 2-seaters and the rest were single-seaters, but still, it kept basically, roughly speaking, a 2-to-1 ratio. And speaking of armament and everything else, what do we have here? In the left wing port side root, we have a standard M 61 cannon with 525 rounds. Under each wing we have 5 hardpoints, so big expansion from a lot of aircraft, certainly compared to the F1. Of course, we have wingtip rails, but they're really only useful for air-to-air defense missiles. The inboard and centerline hardpoints are plumbed for fuel tanks, and this thing can carry almost 10,000 pounds in external fuel. Plus, there are provisions to carry various potted equipments, infrared detection, jamming, whatever you need on the typical area you'd see for an F-16. So this thing's pretty stacked. By the way, it can carry about 18,000 pounds in external stores. Of course, if you do that, you're going to pay some weight penalties. But keep in mind, that's basically an F-4 Phantom in a much smaller package. This thing is about 51 feet long. Even with the larger wing, it's only about a 36.5-foot wingspan. And even though it's heavier than a standard F-16, it's still capable of achieving Mach 2 thanks to the General Electric engine. And it can hit an altitude of at least 59,000 feet. So maybe not quite as high as the F-15, but getting up there. Not bad for a multi-role fighter. I should point out that Lockheed Martin on their website calls this a support fighter. And Mitsubishi calls this a close support fighter. Just, I don't know, terminology, you know. And speaking of, the division of labor can be seen in this aircraft. In the U.S., Lockheed Martin would provide several components, including the wing flaps and the rear of the fuselage, plus many other things. I don't want to downplay it. The center bit was, partially by Kawasaki and partially by Fuji, depending on where you're at exactly, with Kawasaki really building the bulk and Fuji kind of doing bits and bobs and doors and really the vertical tail. And that left Mitsubishi doing the radome and the front end of the fuselage. Now I'm super oversimplifying. You can look up a list of the actual components they provided. You know, it gets into wing skin and this door for that and that door for this, not to mention the components. But yeah, it's kind of funny. You can kind of look at who did what. It's actually amazing it came together as well as it did, quite frankly. But then again, this was a major project, which was one reason it needed to go forward. Not only did this push technology forward in Japan, but it gave dozens, maybe even hundreds of companies work in a post-Cold War budget, and gave thousands, tens of thousands of workers jobs. So, yeah. Now, this model here, we see it in an air-to-air intercept role with 4 short-range missiles. These would be the AAM-3s. And then 4 medium-range beyond visual missiles, plus 2 external tanks and a pod. But air-to-air was its secondary role. Since the early 80s, its first love, so it could replace the F1, and for that matter, F4, and supplement the F-15J, was in the anti-shipping. See, told you I'd show you a single-seater. This is, of course, the F-2A, and this is in its typical long-range endurance maritime patrol anti-shipping role. Sometimes they might carry 2 ASM-1, ASM-2s, but they wanted 4. That was part of the requirement, so they could double what the F1 carried. And they might often just carry 2 of the AAM-3, but this one's set up for 4, which it can easily do, and still have room for up to 3 tanks. I should point out that the ASM-1 is known as the Type 80 anti-ship missile. It was introduced in 1980 for the F1, so it was available from the beginning for this. The AAM-3 is known as the Type 90, so started in production in 1990. So while this can take the AIM-9 Sidewinder, the L version, you don't really see that. You typically see the Mitsubishi missile on this. It can take the AIM 120 as well, although you rarely see that. And originally these were often fitted with the AIM 7F or A7M Sparrow, till newer things would come along. I love this configuration with the big anti-ship missiles. They're just pretty dang impressive. So, after over half a decade of delay, the first full production models were delivered to the military, the JASDF, in March of 2005. And they would begin training up various squadrons. In 2006, we talked about the F1 retiring. This is really what allowed it. And in June of 2007, this had its first overseas trip, voyage, deployment. It would do exercises alongside the U.S., actually F-18 Hornets as it happens, in Edwards Air Force Base. And they would conduct several exercises together. And during this time, the F-2A or F-2B would drop live ordnance in military service for the first time. Just training, of course. Oh, one thing I should mention, even though this has 3 external fuel tanks plus internal fuel, unlike the F-15J, this does not have the ability to refuel in the air. That was seen as too provocative, too aggressive, because these would be patrolling near Chinese and Russian islands and potentially intercepting Chinese and Russian planes. It's just, politics. But it had the carriage abilities. So that's the anti-shipping configuration here. The last new production F2 was delivered from Mitsubishi's Nagoya factory in 2011, September 27. Again, with a total of 94 production and 4 pre-production updated to standard produced. So more than the F1, but fewer than they originally had planned for, which is often the case with military aircraft, if we're being completely honest. But of course, this allowed them to retire many older aircraft, and the pilots quickly gain appreciation for it. It's a true multi-role fighter. It's the first time in this video we've looked at a true multi-role that's equally good at air-to-air or air-to-surface, anti-shipping, and also air-to-ground attack or close air support. So here's the third role. One more Viper Zero for you, another F2A. And this one's in the ground attack configuration. These could carry standard 500-pound bombs. Not sure if they can do 750 or not. I would imagine so, but 500 is only listed. So like Mark 82s. They could also carry rocket pods. And they can carry cluster munitions, cluster bombs. And finally, they can carry guided ordnance and JDAMs, that kind of thing. So with their multiple hardpoints and cannon with over 500 rounds and quite good endurance and or range, this was quite a good close air support aircraft. The F1 was limited by its fuel and only really having 4 hardpoints, and that's if you don't really need fuel tanks. 5 maybe. But the F2 really shows you they are kind of learning lessons, and you can set it up however it needs to be, frankly. Changing out the pod in the front or not having one at all. And of course the computers inside are programmable, sorry guys, and upgradable as any modern aircraft will be. and it's pretty dang flexible, which you can hang under the wings. Something that, as the 21st century moved on with, Japan took advantage of with a few different upgrade and update programs. Not as many as with the F-15, but still some. And it's had an interesting service record. Some tragedies and some successes. So let's kind of end by talking about its nearly 20 years of JASDF service. I guess I should also just mention these were never exported. That's kind of the theme with any Japanese aircraft because of their politics and laws. So yeah, only used by them. So yeah, by 2007, service was commencing. I said earlier Edwards, I meant Anderson. I knew that wasn't right when it came out of my mouth for the exercise. Sorry. Oh well. You get what you pay for. And from there, these haven't really been called upon for their close air support role so much. Even the anti-shipping, even though they do patrols, especially with the increased aggression from the Chinese Navy, what they've really been used for are air-to-air interceptions and basically fighter patrol. It's pretty much been the career of the F-2 and the JASDF. So to that end, let's bring the air-to-air version back out. In 2012, the Japanese government announced that 60 F-2s would get an update to their radar system, giving them a longer range, also the ability to not only track but also fire upon multiple targets. And this would correspond with working with a new missile variant. The F-15J had, at least in some small numbers, already been working with the newer AAM-4, which is a beyond visual range, medium range to long range missile, kind of like the AIM-120C or even D. Well, the next version is the AAM-4B. And this is interesting because it has an ESA radar seeker in the warhead. Quite interesting to have an active array. This gives a lot more fire and forget ability, less tracking time, longer range, and in conjunction with the newer equipment, these upgraded aircraft are supposed to have a lot better, more modern abilities, also able to fire at a longer distance and therefore keep themselves safer. And they would carry up to 4 of these AAM-4Bs on an aerial patrol. In 2013, things really heated up. February 7th, they would intercept 2 Russian Sukhoi Su-27s that just entered Japanese airspace. And then in August, they would actually intercept Russian Tupolev bombers entering into Japanese airspace. And beyond that, of course, there's also Chinese. Looking at the years, it's usually Chinese intercepts more than Russian, although there have been years where, yeah, the Russian aircraft are doing more. In 2019, the JASDF did over 900 intercepts, F-2s and F-15s namely, and sometimes it got pretty hairy, pretty aggressive. They even took pictures to prove, hey, you're in our airspace. Why are you here? And so there have been some updates to the aircraft to keep it competitive with increasing aggression. Of course, we also can talk about how Japan is now floating aircraft carriers for the first time since World War II. Yeah, they started off as helicopter carriers, but with newer aircraft, they're essentially aircraft carriers. So these have actually proven themselves quite valuable, and the plan is to keep them in service well into the 2030s. Unfortunately, the limited production run means that the Japanese only have about 60 of the single-seat and 25 of the two-seaters still in service, because there have been losses and there have been some that just frankly wear out. Let's end where we began with the training version, because we have two accidents. In 2007, a F-2B was lost because of bad wiring, and in 2019 a second F-2B was lost, and it seems like it was actually wing stress. In September of 2020, during an inspection of a different aircraft, they found stress fractures in the composite wings, so the fleet was grounded for about a month, and it was allowed to go back up in October of that year. So they're being a lot more careful looking at the wings, replacing parts that need it. So it's possible the 2019 loss was because of that. The good news is both times the crew ejected, both of them, and were safe. So no loss of life there. But it did mean that two of the already limited two-seat models were gone. But in 2011, the fleet took a pretty good hit. Japan has earthquakes. It's part of it. And that year, one of them did major damage to 18 F-2s at a base. Of those, 5 are just written off, totally just gone. 13 were eventually rebuilt, but it would take several years. Even by 2014, they weren't right up to strength. So they did save them, losing 5, rescuing 13, but it came at a cost. Like I said, production was over in 2011. The lines are done. Refurbishing the airframes, repairing the damage, actually cost more per plane than it would have been just to buy new ones from Mitsubishi. But what choice did they have? They had picked the F-35A in 2011, and surprise, surprise, it was well behind schedule. The F-15's future was, back and forth with the government. Obviously, the F-4 is getting towards the end of its days. The F-1 was long since retired. They had to make do with the F-2s, and to be fair, at that time, some of them were practically brand new, and the oldest ones were only about a decade. So, yeah. But it does show losses. But they've done what they can to update the fleet with modern weapons. The newest weapon that's possibly getting integrated is the AAM-5, which is a short-range visual self-defense missile, replacing the AAM-3, so kind of a Sidewinder analog. I don't know if those have actually, I know they've been tested and they work with the F2, but I don't know if any have been fielded. They probably have now, but hey, do as you must. So that's the 4th generation fleet. And we have one more famous, infamous aircraft to talk about. But it won't take long, because really its story just beginning. It seems like with these videos, at least for the Western world, it always ends with the Lockheed Martin F-35. When we did the British videos, it was the F-35B, the V-stall capable. For Japan, it's mostly the F-35A, the more conventional version. As I said earlier, they really wanted the F-22, but they finally gave up on that around 2009. And in 2011, they picked this aircraft. And Japan would actually grow to be the largest foreign customer with the most Lightnings on order. But of course, like everyone else, they had to wait for several years. And they weren't even the worst hit. In fact, their pre-production version, or their prototype version, known as the AX-1, flew in 2016. So, they're doing better than some. And the first Lightnings were delivered to Japan in 2018. And so that was its official service date, and training began. The F-35 is a 5th generation aircraft, which basically means stealth and modern weapons capability and a very, very fancy cockpit and helmet. It's actually slightly smaller than the F2. It's about 50 feet long and a wingspan of 35 feet. And it's a little slower too, at about Mach 1.6. And it doesn't have quite the altitude at about 50,000 feet. And it doesn't have quite the payload, although they are very close. It can carry out 18,000 pounds, slightly less than the F2. But the F2 has provision for 3 external tanks, and you don't really see the F-35 with external tanks, so it's on internal fuel only. And it has 3 hard points under each wing, plus 4 hard points in the internal bay. The problem with the internal bay for the Japanese, most of their ordnance don't fit in it, like the AAM-4 or the ASM-2. So they're having to kind of work with that to develop new combinations. They're working a lot with like the Meteor missiles out of Europe. And the F-35, as far as I know, is cleared for the AIM-9X. The British have the ASROM, the AIM-132, but the AAM-3, AAM-5, at least as of now, don't work with this. So this is fitted with the AIM-9X. I don't want to disparage the aircraft, and it does have, again, stealth abilities, more up-to-date data link systems, definitely a more intuitive cockpit when it works. And Japan decided to buy in quite strong. In 2018, they ordered 105 F-35As, and they were showing interest in a smaller number of F-35Bs. The next year, the government approved conversion of their helicopter carriers into short takeoff and landing aircraft carriers to kind of counter the Chinese fleet. So with that, they placed an order for 42 F-35Bs. These would operate from carriers, but they were also planning to operate from shore bases as well. And in addition, U.S. Marine-controlled F-35Bs would work alongside and operate with the Japanese on their own carriers to foster better interoperability and just better relations in general. So deliveries were underway. The first squad to transition over was the 302nd, letting go of their F4s, and they declared initial operational readiness at the end, or towards the end of 2019. And then at the very end of 2020, December, the second squadron was transitioning over, the 301st, as they were retiring their Phantoms. If you remember back, their last Phantom flights were in March of 2021 because the Japanese must retire aircraft in March. So we have 2 complete squadrons. And it's gone mostly well. Although in April of 2019, an F-35A was lost, which was pretty big in the media. At that time, Japan only had just over a dozen in service, but deliveries continued. It was up to 2 dozen by the end of the next year. And at this point, Mitsubishi is a prime contractor working on these. The F-35A can't be said to be made in one nation. This is a joint project. But with Japan ordering as many as 147, they're going to get a pretty good stake, especially in their region, the Pacific area. Mitsubishi has started working on components, for example, the radar system. They're doing final assembly and checking. They're also building in-house, or at least in the country, the F-135 engine, mostly. Everything's kind of shifted around, but yeah. And in 2020, they declared that they were ready to start acting as a service depot, not just for their aircraft, but that's the idea behind the F-35, is if all allies fly these, any depot in the world can service anyone's aircraft. Nice in theory. We'll see how it works out. But they declared that. At the time, Mitsubishi's in the process of building roughly 38 aircraft. So they're planning on building the F-35A mostly in Japan, or at least final assembly, although some are still being built in the US and shipped over. Now the F-35B, because it's a much smaller number and a pretty complicated aircraft, those are all going to be built in the US and then shipped over to Japan. At least that's the plan right now. And whereas the 35A was declared service by 2018. The 35B is still not technically in JASDF service. Its projected service date is 2025, although we have started to see some early testing and training with pilots, especially working off carriers, and that's going to take some time to work up. It will be very interesting to see if they actually do acquire nearly 150, and if they don't, where they stop. It'll also be interesting to see how that impacts the fate of, the other aircraft. One thing I want to talk about at the end here, though, is also the naming of the squadrons. I mentioned it at the beginning, so let's do that and wrap this thing up, because I got to get back to work. Japanese squadrons, or Hikotai, were pretty much grouped originally by their number. The single digits, 1, 2, 3, were first assigned to the F-86F Saber, so the day fighter. The 100 series, 101, 102, were given the F-86D Saber Dog, so the all-weather or night fighter interceptor. Next, the 200 series were assigned the F-104J, F-104DJ, so true interceptors. And then finally, the 300 series obtained the F-4EJ, the Phantoms. So that's where it begins. Now the 1 series, once they gave up their F-86s and worked their way through, they would end up with the F1 and then eventually some with the F2 because of their ground attack ability. Remember, the F-86F did have some limited ground attack, so go there. Kind of the same reasoning, the 300 series with the Phantoms are the ones we're seeing first switch over to the 35A, the Lightnings. Kind of interesting. Today, Japan flies roughly 11 squads, give or take. You've got around half a dozen flying the F-15J or DJ. You've got 3 flying the F-2, A or B, and now 2 flying the F-35A. And I could be off for a bit, I'm sure I am. I'm just kind of going off memory, but it gives you kind of an idea of the ratio. So the F-15 still makes up the bulk. And of course the F-2 is great because it's a multi-role, as is the F-35. So that's kind of how things are set up in Japan. What do you think? This was a lot of fun, which is probably why I ended up being longer than I planned. I really do have to get back to work. The bad thing about doing these videos, I love doing them. I hate getting everything back on the shelf. It is such a pain in the neck. But I do it for you guys because A, I love history and just enjoy it. And B, I really do hope this is interesting and entertaining for you. I did get things wrong, even I know that now. I'm not a paid history channel, You start giving me a check, and you're going to get citations and proofreading, and I'll edit stuff when I goof, but when we're just hanging out, it's like hanging out with a friend, They're going to say things wrong. But, oh well. At least, if nothing else, I hope it will spur you to get interested and maybe study up, if not on these aircraft, maybe something else in history. Whatever kind of floats your boat. But yeah, here we have from Generation 1, 2, 3, 4, and even Generation 5 fighter in Japanese Air Self-Defense Force service. So, let me know what you think. Please do comment and sub if you haven't. That'd help a lot. And if you really like to help, go over and check out the link to the Patreon for Mishaco. It's all the same thing. It's all me. So, yeah. All right. Going back to work, guys. This is Misha. Catch you very soon in a while, because this is going to take me a long time to put back up.